Beneath the crown's glitter lies a trail of shadows. Across empires and centuries, powerful kings have turned their thrones into prisons for the women they once vowed to cherish. From Rome's marble halls to Asia's forbidden palaces, betrayal, paranoia, and ambition drove monarchs to condemn their own queens and consorts. In this video, we uncover the chilling stories of 30 kings who brutally killed their wives, a journey through history's darkest chambers, where love was sacrificed for power. Are you ready to step into the throne rooms where devotion turned deadly? Before we dive into these gripping stories, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss our journey into history's darkest secrets. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now as you join us on this exploration. Henry VIII of England. Few monarchs in history embody the brutal combination of power, fear, and personal obsession quite like Henry VIII of England. His reign from 1509 to 1547 is remembered for dramatic political shifts, religious upheavals, and of course, the tragic fates of some of his 6 wives. Among them, 2 wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, were condemned to death under Henry's authority, marking him as one of the most infamous rulers who killed the women he had once vowed to cherish. When Henry married Anne Boleyn in 1533, she represented both passion and ambition. Henry had broken with the Catholic Church in Rome to annul his first marriage and wed Anne, igniting the English Reformation. For a time, she embodied the fulfillment of his dream, a younger queen who could provide a male heir. Yet, as the years went by, Anne failed to deliver the son Henry so desperately desired, giving birth instead to Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. Court politics, personal frustration, and Henry's wandering affections soon turned against her. By 1536, enemies of Anne painted her as a dangerous, manipulative figure accused of adultery, incest, and treason. While modern historians agree that these charges were fabricated, the outcome was chillingly real. Anne was tried and condemned, and Henry did not intervene to save her. On the 19th of May 1536, Anne was executed by sword within the Tower of London walls. Henry, who once risked everything to have her, now coldly sanctioned her death, setting an example of how swiftly love could transform into lethal rejection when royal pride and dynastic goals were at stake. Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, would face a similar fate only a few years later. She was very young, probably in her late teens, when she caught Henry's attention. The aging king was desperate for vitality and affection, and Catherine provided him with a sense of renewal. However, whispers of her past relationships began to surface. Accusations of unfaithfulness both prior to and during her marriage spread through court circles. By 1542, the scandal reached its peak, and Henry once again turned to charges of treason. Catherine was tried, condemned, and executed at the Tower of London. Her youth and inexperience, no defense against the wrath of a king unwilling to be shamed. She was said to have asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her cell so she could practice placing her head upon it, a haunting image of someone preparing for the inevitable. Henry's decision to execute Catherine underscored his ruthless resolve to maintain authority and dignity no matter the personal or moral cost. The pattern of these deaths reveals more than just personal betrayals. They highlight how Henry's reign was defined by a merging of private desires with public power. His insecurities as a ruler and a man were projected onto the women closest to him, and when they failed to deliver either loyalty or heirs in his eyes, their lives were expendable. The machinery of the Tudor state courts, judges, and even Parliament, was bent to Henry's will to justify outcomes he had already decided upon. For the people of England, the deaths of Anne and Catherine created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Queens, once revered as symbols of grace and continuity, could now fall as easily as any courtier. Henry had turned the royal marriage into a high-stakes gamble where the price of failure was not simply disgrace, but death. Yet, these actions also cemented Henry's image as a monarch who could not be crossed, reinforcing the idea that even queens were subject to his unchecked authority. Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, would eventually rise to the throne and reverse her mother's fate in history, ruling with unmatched brilliance. Still, the shadow of Henry's choices lingered across the dynasty. His legacy of brutality in marriage became one of the defining features of his reputation, overshadowing his political reforms and military campaigns. Henry VIII remains a chilling reminder of how absolute power, combined with personal insecurity, can transform the bonds of love into sentences of death. His willingness to execute 2 of his wives is not only a testament to his tyranny, but also a stark warning about the peril of unchecked authority. And while his story is well known, it is only the beginning. Because beyond England's shores, in the heart of Rome, another emperor, Claudius, would also order the death of his empress, Valeria Messalina, in a tale where love, betrayal, and politics collided just as fatally. Emperor Claudius. The Roman Empire was a stage where personal desires, political intrigue, and deadly rivalries often played out in shocking fashion. Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE, is one of the most fascinating figures of this world. Though often underestimated by his contemporaries as physically weak and politically naive, Claudius proved to be far more astute than many expected. He expanded the empire, improved its infrastructure, and strengthened the administration. Yet, his personal life, especially his marriage to Valeria Messalina, revealed the darker side of power, culminating in her execution in 48 CE on his orders. Messalina was Claudius's 3rd wife, and, at least at first, she seemed to play the role of a loyal empress. Young, beautiful, and influential, she quickly became a central figure at court. But the Roman imperial court was a place of whispers and rivalries, and Messalina's reputation soon took on a notorious life of its own. Ancient sources such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio painted her as ambitious and scandalous, accusing her of manipulative plots and reckless behavior. It is worth remembering that Roman historians often wrote with dramatic flair, exaggerating details to emphasize the dangers of court corruption. Yet even with this in mind, it is clear that Messalina's actions and the way others perceived them eventually led her into direct conflict with the emperor's authority. The breaking point came in 48 CE when Messalina was accused of entering into a bigamous marriage with Gaius Silius, a Roman senator. This was no minor scandal. Even if political motives drove the accusation, the claim was explosive. A reigning empress supposedly marrying another man while her husband, the emperor, still lived. Such an act could be interpreted as a bid to overthrow Claudius, with Silius positioned to claim imperial authority through her. Whether Messalina truly conspired to replace Claudius, or whether her enemies seized an opportunity to destroy her, the threat to the emperor's legitimacy was undeniable. Claudius was informed of the situation while away from the palace, and for a time, he seemed uncertain. He had shown deep affection for Messalina in the past, and some accounts suggest he considered forgiving her even at this late stage. But his advisors, particularly the powerful freedman Narcissus, pressed him to act decisively. They warned that hesitation could leave him vulnerable, perhaps even cost him his throne. To survive in Roman politics, even an emperor had to appear firm. The verdict was swift. Messalina was condemned without trial, a stark reminder of how little protection existed even for an empress when imperial authority was at stake. According to accounts, she fled to the gardens of Lucullus, distraught and desperate. Claudius, however, had given orders that ended any hope of reconciliation. Messalina was executed, her once powerful position offering no shield against the will of the emperor and his council. Claudius's decision illustrates the brutal pragmatism that often defined Roman rule. Despite personal feelings, he could not risk being seen as weak. Allowing Messalina to live after such accusations might have emboldened rivals and undermined his authority. By authorizing her death, Claudius demonstrated that no one, not even his wife, was beyond the reach of imperial justice when the stability of the throne was at stake. The story of Claudius and Messalina also reflects the dangers faced by women in positions of influence within ancient courts. Empresses, queens, and consorts often wielded significant power behind the scenes, but this power came with immense risk. Any hint of disloyalty, whether real or fabricated, could quickly become fatal. Messalina's downfall was not only about her alleged actions, but also about the environment of fear and suspicion that surrounded the imperial household. In the aftermath of Messalina's death, Claudius continued to rule for another 6 years. He later remarried his fourth wife, being Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Nero, thus intertwining his fate with yet another woman who would leave her mark on Roman history. Claudius himself would eventually die under suspicious circumstances, with many historians suspecting Agrippina's involvement. His reign, therefore, is framed by the rise and fall of powerful women, whose influence both supported and threatened the emperor. For later generations, the fall of Messalina became a cautionary tale about ambition and betrayal. Ancient writers often embellished her story, portraying her as the archetype of the dangerous, scheming empress. Modern historians take a more nuanced view, recognizing that much of her notorious reputation may have been shaped by political propaganda. Yet, the fact remains. Claudius, whether reluctantly or not, ordered her execution, making him one of the kings and emperors in history who fatally turned against his wife. Claudius's choice underscores a recurring theme in the history of rulers. Love and trust could never outweigh the demands of power and survival. To remain emperor, he silenced the one person who should have been closest to him, and while his reign continued, the shadow of that decision lingered. But Claudius was not the last Roman emperor to condemn his wife. His successor in infamy, Nero, would go even further, sending his young wife Claudia Octavia to her death and forever etching his name into history's dark annals. History has a way of drawing us in with its twists and betrayals, and there's so much more ahead. If you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to subscribe so you'll be here for every chapter we uncover. And I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is as you're watching. Emperor Nero. Among Rome's emperors, few are as infamous as Nero. His name has become shorthand for cruelty, extravagance, and the corruption of absolute power. Ruling from 54 to 68 CE, Nero's reign was filled with contradictions. On one hand, he patronized the arts, promoted grand architectural projects, and cultivated a public image of sophistication. On the other hand, he earned a reputation for paranoia, vanity, and ruthless violence toward those closest to him. One of the most telling episodes of his reign was the fate of his first wife, Claudia Octavia, whom he ordered to be executed in 62 CE. Her death highlights not only Nero's personal flaws but also the dangerous dynamics of life within the imperial palace. Claudia Octavia was the daughter of Emperor Claudius and Valeria Messalina, making her a child of the imperial bloodline and a vital link to Rome's Julio-Claudian dynasty. After Claudius's death and Nero's ascent to the throne, Octavia became his empress. At the time of their marriage, Octavia was widely admired by the Roman populace. She was seen as dignified, modest, and a stabilizing presence within a turbulent political climate. For Nero, marrying Octavia strengthened his legitimacy, binding him more tightly to the dynastic heritage of Augustus. Yet, despite her value as a political partner, Octavia was not cherished by Nero. Ancient sources portray their marriage as cold and loveless. Nero's passions lay elsewhere first, with his mistress, later wife, Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was ambitious, charming, and adept at manipulating court politics. She became a powerful influence over Nero, and her rivalry with Octavia set the stage for tragedy. By the early 62nd CE, Octavia's position at court was increasingly precarious. Though adored by the Roman people, she had failed to produce an heir, something Nero and his advisors viewed as essential for dynastic continuity. Her inability to bear children, whether due to natural circumstance or Nero's lack of devotion, became a source of tension. Meanwhile, Poppaea's influence grew, and she pressed Nero to set Octavia aside. For an emperor already known for his impatience with obstacles, the situation became intolerable. In 62 CE, Nero formally divorced Octavia, citing vague accusations of infertility and misconduct. But dismissing her from the palace was not enough. Octavia's popularity with the Roman public posed a constant threat to Nero's rule. Crowds protested in her defense, chanting her name in the streets and demanding her return. These demonstrations rattled Nero, who feared unrest and potential rebellion. In the Roman Empire, emperors were expected to project strength, and yielding to public pressure was considered a sign of weakness. To eliminate Octavia as a source of opposition, Nero escalated the charges against her. She was accused of treason and adultery, allegations that were likely fabricated but carried deadly consequences in Roman law. With little ceremony, Nero ordered her banishment and eventual execution. Ancient writers describe her end as particularly unjust, emphasizing her innocence and the loyalty she inspired among ordinary Romans. Her death was a chilling reminder that even an empress, born into Rome's most illustrious family, was powerless against the suspicions of a ruler determined to secure his authority. Octavia's execution left a deep scar on public sentiment. Unlike many members of the imperial family who were despised or feared, Octavia had been widely beloved. Her death sparked outrage and sorrow, tarnishing Nero's image further. Even those who had once tolerated his excesses saw this act as proof of his cruelty and disregard for Roman tradition. In the minds of many, Nero had destroyed not just his wife, but also a living symbol of continuity with the great Claudian line. The elimination of Octavia also paved the way for Poppaea Sabina to ascend as empress, cementing her role as Nero's partner. Yet even this did not guarantee peace or stability. Poppaea's own fate would later be surrounded by suspicion, with stories of her death at Nero's hands, though those accounts remain disputed and are often classified as rumor rather than firm fact. Regardless, the sequence of events demonstrated a dangerous cycle. Anyone close to the emperor was vulnerable, and personal relationships were always entangled with political survival. For Nero himself, the execution of Octavia exemplified his descent into paranoia and despotism. By removing a popular empress, he alienated much of the Roman populace, further isolating himself within a court already rife with intrigue. His reign would continue for several more years, but his eventual downfall in 68 CE, marked by rebellion and his own forced suicide, was in part fueled by the widespread resentment his actions had created. The story of Nero and Octavia reflects a recurring theme across monarchies and empires. The fate of queens and consorts was often inseparable from the insecurities of kings. In this case, Octavia's virtues, her modesty, loyalty, and popularity, ironically became the very reasons for her destruction, as they threatened the emperor's control. Nero's choice to kill her illustrates how absolute power, when combined with personal resentment, could turn even admiration into a death sentence. As history looks back on Nero, the execution of Claudia Octavia remains one of the defining tragedies of his rule. It is remembered as a moment when political calculation and personal passion collided, and an innocent life was sacrificed to the ambitions of an emperor who cared more for his image than for justice. But the brutality of imperial Rome did not end with Nero. Only a generation earlier, another emperor, Constantine the Great, would face a crisis within his own household, ordering the death of his empress Fausta in circumstances shrouded in mystery and debate, showing once more how dangerous it was to be close to power. Constantine I, the Great. When people hear the name Constantine the Great, they often think of his monumental role in shaping the Roman Empire's transition toward Christianity, his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, or his founding of Constantinople. His legacy as a unifier and reformer has long stood as one of the most consequential in Western history. Yet, hidden within this grand narrative lies a troubling episode that reveals the personal cost of imperial power: the execution of his empress, Fausta, in 326 CE. This event has puzzled historians for centuries, because the reasons behind her death remain shrouded in mystery, recorded only in fragments by later sources. Fausta was the daughter of Emperor Maximian and the second wife of Constantine. Their marriage in 307 CE was politically significant, cementing Constantine's alliance with the powerful Tetrarchic dynasty. Over time, Fausta bore him several children, including Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, who would go on to rule portions of the empire after their father's death. By all appearances, she occupied a secure and honored position at the heart of the imperial household. Yet, in the volatile world of Roman politics, even the most privileged individuals were vulnerable. The year 326 CE marked a turning point. Constantine had just celebrated his 20th year as emperor, a triumphal moment that should have solidified his authority and family's future. Instead, it was overshadowed by internal tragedy. First, his eldest son from an earlier union, Crispus, was executed under circumstances that remain debated. Not long afterward, Fausta herself was put to death. The proximity of these two events has led scholars to speculate about a connection, but the truth has never been conclusively established. Ancient sources differ in their explanations. Some suggest that Fausta was accused of being involved in an illicit relationship with Crispus, perhaps fabricated by palace rivals seeking to eliminate both figures in one sweep. Others propose that she may have plotted against Constantine or his heirs in a bid for power. Later accounts claim she was executed by being confined to an overheated bath, though whether this detail is accurate or symbolic is uncertain. Regardless of the exact method, what is clear is that Constantine, the ruler who would eventually be venerated as the Great, ordered the death of his own empress. The lack of clarity surrounding Fausta's execution is telling. In Roman imperial history, official narratives were carefully crafted to protect the image of the emperor. In this case, the silence and contradictions in the record may indicate an effort to erase an uncomfortable episode. Constantine, after all, was in the process of aligning himself with Christianity, presenting himself as a divinely chosen leader. The execution of his wife did not fit easily into this image, and so the story was obscured, leaving future generations with only hints and speculation. What we can discern is that Fausta's downfall reflects the brutal reality of palace politics. The imperial family was not just a private household, but also the very center of Roman power. Every member carried political weight, and alliances or rivalries within the family could alter the course of the empire itself. In this context, accusations, even unproven ones, were potentially fatal. Whether Fausta was guilty of betrayal or simply fell victim to political maneuvering, Constantine judged that her continued presence was a threat too great to ignore. For Constantine himself, the decision must have been agonizing. He had relied on Fausta for nearly 2 decades, and together they had built the dynasty that would outlast him. Yet the execution underscores the principle that, for Roman emperors, personal bonds were always subordinate to political necessity. The stability of the throne mattered more than affection, and even a beloved empress could be sacrificed if her presence risked undermining the emperor's authority. The tragedy of Fausta also reminds us that the great titles given to rulers often obscure their more troubling deeds. Constantine's military victories and religious reforms shaped centuries of history, but his willingness to condemn both his son and wife in quick succession illustrates the darker side of his reign. Power, in his world, demanded ruthless decisions, even at the cost of family blood. In the centuries that followed, Christian chroniclers grappled with how to interpret this episode. Some downplayed it, others ignored it altogether, and a few tried to cast it as divine punishment for sins within the imperial family. The uncertainty of their responses reflects the difficulty of reconciling Constantine's celebrated legacy with the undeniable fact that he executed his empress. For Fausta, history offers little voice. She remains a shadowy figure remembered mainly for her death rather than her life, a casualty of both political intrigue and the harsh judgments of posterity. Yet her story serves as a sobering reminder that behind the grandeur of emperors and the majesty of their courts lay fragile human lives, often extinguished by the very power that was meant to protect them. And just as Constantine's household was torn apart by suspicion and execution, another royal court in Judea would be haunted by a similar fate. Herod the Great, famed for his architectural wonders and his paranoia, would order the death of his beloved Queen Mariamne I, proving once more that in the world of kings, even love could be no defense against the demands of power. Herod the Great, Judea. Herod the Great, who ruled Judea from 37 to 4 BCE under the suzerainty of Rome, is often remembered for his architectural achievements. Massive building projects such as the expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, the fortress of Masada, and the port city of Caesarea Maritima. Yet his reign was also marked by deep paranoia, political turbulence, and violent purges. At the heart of his personal life, one of the most tragic episodes was the execution of his queen, Mariamne I. Her death, ordered by Herod himself, has long been seen as a dark symbol of how suspicion and insecurity could corrode even the most intimate of relationships. Mariamne I was no ordinary consort. She was a Hasmonean princess, descended from the dynasty that had ruled Judea before Rome's intervention. Her marriage to Herod was highly political. By wedding her, Herod tied himself to the prestigious Hasmonean line, thereby legitimizing his authority in the eyes of many Judeans who viewed him as a Roman-backed outsider. Mariamne brought both beauty and royal pedigree to the marriage, and for a time she appeared to be the jewel of Herod's court. Their union also produced several children, further cementing her role as the queen who linked two powerful houses. Yet, despite her importance to his dynasty, Mariamne became the focus of Herod's consuming jealousy and suspicion. Ancient historian Josephus, the main source for this period, describes her as proud, independent, and unwilling to hide her disdain for Herod's family. She openly clashed with members of Herod's circle, particularly his mother and sister, who resented her Hasmonean heritage and influence. These tensions grew over time, feeding into the already volatile atmosphere of the Judean court. Herod's paranoia was not baseless in every respect. The Hasmonean family still retained sympathizers who longed to see the old dynasty restored. Herod feared that Mariamne, with her royal bloodline, might serve as a rallying point for opposition against him. As political pressures mounted, his insecurities intensified. Josephus recounts that Herod was so fearful of betrayal that he left orders that if he himself were ever killed, Mariamne was to be executed immediately, lest she fall into the hands of a rival. The breaking point came when Herod was accused of plotting against Mariamne, or vice versa, depending on the version of events. According to Josephus, Herod's own relatives and courtiers spread damaging rumors, painting the queen as unfaithful or disloyal. The specifics are difficult to untangle. Historians debate whether Mariamne truly engaged in any treasonous behavior, but in the toxic environment of Herod's court, suspicion alone was enough to seal her fate. Eventually, Herod ordered Mariamne's execution, a decision that shocked even those accustomed to the harsh realities of ancient politics. Despite his paranoia, Herod was said to have loved Mariamne deeply, and accounts suggest that after her death, he was consumed by grief and regret. This paradox, killing the woman he loved most, yet mourning her loss, so profoundly illustrates the tragic duality of Herod's character. He was both a ruler desperate to secure his throne, and a man undone by the very choices he made to protect it. The execution of Mariamne left a lasting mark on Herod's reputation. To his subjects, it was a sign that their king was both ruthless and unstable. The Hasmonean dynasty, already weakened, was dealt another blow, and Herod's own children by Mariamne became pawns in the continuing struggle for succession. In later years, Herod would also execute some of those children, convinced that they, too, posed threats to his reign. The cycle of suspicion never ended, and Mariamne's death became the first in a chain of family tragedies that haunted the Herodian dynasty. For later generations, Mariamne's story was retold as a cautionary tale. Poets, dramatists, and historians across centuries have depicted her as a victim of both political intrigue and her husband's destructive insecurities. In these portrayals, she often symbolizes innocence destroyed by tyranny, her dignity standing in stark contrast to Herod's paranoia. Whether or not Josephus embellished details for dramatic effect, the essential truth remains. Mariamne, Queen of Judea, was condemned by her own husband. A man whose legacy as the Great was forever stained by the blood of his family. Herod's act illustrates a recurring theme seen across many monarchies: the tension between personal affection and political calculation. A ruler may genuinely love a spouse, but when loyalty is questioned, affection can give way to deadly suspicion. In Herod's case, his ambition and fear of losing power outweighed even his deepest attachments. The result was not only personal devastation, but also political instability, as his actions eroded trust within the royal household and the wider community. Herod the Great stands as a paradox in history. On one hand, he left behind enduring monuments that testify to his vision and determination. On the other, he became infamous for acts of cruelty that betrayed his own family. The execution of Mariamne I is perhaps the clearest symbol of this paradox. A ruler capable of great achievement, but also of catastrophic personal decisions that undermined the very dynasty he sought to preserve. And as shocking as Herod's actions were, he was not alone. In the ancient world, rulers often viewed their wives as extensions of their power rather than partners in life. Not long after, in another ancient kingdom, Ptolemaic Egypt, a ruler named Ptolemy XI would go even further, killing his queen Berenice III in a calculated act that shocked his people and destabilized his throne. Ptolemy XI. The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt was notorious for its complex family politics, frequent betrayals, and violent struggles for power. It was a world where marriages were not primarily about love, but about consolidating authority, legitimizing rule, and maintaining dynastic continuity. Few stories illustrate the volatility of this dynasty more starkly than that of Ptolemy XI, Alexander II, and his queen Berenice III. Their union ended almost as quickly as it began, with the shocking murder of the queen by the king himself in 80 BCE, an act that not only sealed his own downfall but also highlighted the dangerous intersection of personal ambition and political necessity in ancient monarchies. Berenice III was not an ordinary royal figure. She was a descendant of the powerful Ptolemaic line, the daughter of Ptolemy IX and Cleopatra Selene. By the time she came to power, she had already demonstrated political skill and earned the respect of the Egyptian people. She ruled briefly as sole monarch after the death of her father, and her reign, though short, was noted for a rare degree of stability in a dynasty often plagued by internal conflict. Berenice's popularity stemmed from her reputation for fairness, dignity, and her connection to the traditions of the Ptolemaic house. When Rome began to exert increasing influence over Egyptian affairs, however, the situation changed. The Roman Senate, seeking to maintain control over its strategically vital ally, orchestrated the placement of Ptolemy XI on the throne. He was a younger, less experienced member of the dynasty and was installed largely as a client king to serve Roman interests. To cement his legitimacy in Egypt, he was compelled to marry Berenice III, who was both his stepmother and cousin, as was common practice in the Ptolemaic dynasty to preserve the purity of royal bloodlines. The marriage, however, was ill-fated from the start. For the Egyptians, Berenice represented continuity, tradition, and respect for the dynasty's heritage. Ptolemy XI, by contrast, was widely viewed as a Roman puppet, imposed upon them without genuine authority or merit. The stark difference in their popularity and standing created a dangerous imbalance in their union. While Berenice's presence might have legitimized Ptolemy's rule, it also cast him in her shadow. He was seen as dependent upon her rather than as a sovereign in his own right. Within a matter of weeks, some sources say just 19 days of their marriage, Ptolemy XI committed an act that shocked Egypt. He had Berenice murdered. The reasons behind this drastic decision remain debated. Some historians believe he acted out of fear that Berenice's popularity would eclipse his own authority. Others suggest that Roman advisors may have influenced his choice, viewing Berenice as too independent and potentially resistant to Roman oversight. Whatever the motive, the murder was both politically reckless and personally devastating to the Egyptian people. The reaction was immediate and furious. Berenice had been loved and respected, and her sudden, violent removal was perceived as a betrayal not only of her but also of Egypt's stability and dignity. Outrage erupted across Alexandria, the Ptolemaic capital, where mobs rose up against Ptolemy XI. Far from securing his position, the murder destroyed any legitimacy he might have hoped to claim. The public stormed the palace, and Ptolemy XI himself was killed within days of Berenice's death. His reign, brief and ignominious, ended as swiftly as it began. The story of Ptolemy XI and Berenice III underscores a recurring theme in monarchic history. When rulers saw their wives not as partners but as obstacles to their own power, they often chose violence over compromise. Yet such actions rarely secured their positions for long. Instead, they bred resentment, instability, and rebellion. In this case, the people of Egypt demonstrated that their loyalty was not automatic, but could be withdrawn in the face of betrayal. Ptolemy XI's attempt to eliminate a rival, cost him his throne and his life. Berenice's tragic fate also reveals the vulnerability of queens, even those who were popular and capable. Her marriage to Ptolemy XI was not of her choosing, but imposed as a political solution by Rome. Despite her best efforts to embody continuity and stability, she fell victim to the insecurities of a king who feared her strength. Her death is remembered as one of the most shocking episodes in the long and often violent saga of the Ptolemaic dynasty. For later historians, the episode became a cautionary tale of the dangers of foreign interference in domestic affairs. Rome's attempt to control Egypt through Ptolemy XI backfired spectacularly, demonstrating that imposing rulers against the will of the people could lead to chaos. The murder of Berenice not only tarnished Ptolemy's name, but also signaled the fragility of dynastic politics in the face of external pressures and internal rivalries. In the wider context of ancient history, Ptolemy XI's actions stand as one of the clearest examples of a ruler who destroyed both his queen and himself in one rash decision. His story reminds us that power gained through fear and treachery is often fleeting, while the loyalty of the people, once broken, is nearly impossible to regain. And so, while Egypt mourned Berenice and erased Ptolemy XI from its memory, elsewhere in the Roman world, another emperor was preparing to act in a similarly ruthless way. Caracalla, remembered for his military campaigns and notorious temper, would exile and eventually order the execution of his wife Plautilla, yet another example of how imperial suspicion and ambition turned the bonds of marriage into matters of life and death. Caracalla. Roma. Caracalla, born Lucius Septimius Bassianus in 188 CE, is one of Rome's emperors whose name has become synonymous with brutality, suspicion, and relentless ambition. He ruled as co-emperor with his father Septimius Severus and later with his brother Geta, before consolidating power solely in his own hands after eliminating Geta in 211 CE. Although he is remembered for military reforms and for granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire through the famous Constitutio Antoniniana, Caracalla's reign was also scarred by episodes of cruelty within his own household. Among the most striking of these was his treatment of his wife, Plautilla, whom he first exiled and later ordered to be executed. Plautilla, formerly named Fulvia Plautilla, was the daughter of Gaius Fulvius Plautianus, a powerful praetorian prefect and close ally of Septimius Severus. Her marriage to Caracalla in 202 CE was arranged as part of the political alliance between her father and the imperial family. The union was meant to strengthen ties between Severus and his most trusted officer, binding the future of the empire to the loyalty of Plautianus. In theory, the match secured both families. In practice, however, it was a deeply unhappy marriage from the very beginning. Ancient accounts describe Caracalla as openly hostile toward Plautilla. He reportedly despised her, refusing to treat her as a true partner even after their wedding. His dislike may have stemmed from resentment at being forced into the union, suspicion of her father's influence, or simply his own volatile nature. Whatever the reason, Plautilla found little affection at the Roman court. She and Caracalla had one daughter, but even the existence of a child did not soften the emperor's disdain. The marriage unraveled almost as quickly as it had been arranged. In 205 CE, only 3 years after the wedding, Plautia's fortunes changed dramatically when her father, Plautianus, was accused of treason. According to sources, Caracalla himself may have helped engineer these accusations, which led to Plautianus's downfall and execution. With her father gone, Plautilla's position was immediately weakened. No longer shielded by the immense power of her family, she was now vulnerable to Caracalla's hostility. Caracalla wasted no time in ridding himself of his unwanted wife. Plautilla was banished from the imperial palace and sent into exile, along with her daughter. She was confined to the island of Lipari off the coast of Sicily. For many, exile might have offered a reprieve from court intrigue, but in the Roman world, exile was often only a temporary step toward a darker fate. Living far from the center of power, Plautilla remained under constant surveillance, her life suspended in uncertainty. For several years, Plautilla lived in this forced isolation, cut off from both political influence and personal freedom. She could not have known whether she would ever be recalled or whether her exile was permanent. Meanwhile, Caracalla continued to strengthen his own authority, eventually becoming sole ruler after orchestrating the death of his brother Geta in 211 CE. Once firmly in power, he turned his attention back to his estranged wife. Sometime around 212 CE, Plautilla was executed on Caracalla's orders. The details of her death are sparse, but what is clear is that she was eliminated as part of his broader purge of rivals and threats to his authority. To Caracalla, Plautilla represented a lingering connection to a faction he had long despised: her father's legacy, her popularity as empress, and her very survival were intolerable reminders of a political marriage he had sought to erase. The story of Caracalla and Plautilla is significant not just because of its personal tragedy, but also because it reflects the broader culture of fear within the Roman imperial household. Emperors, constantly beset by conspiracies, both real and imagined, often turned against their closest companions. Wives, in particular, could become scapegoats for political anxieties, their lives caught up in the ruthless calculations of power. For Plautilla, being tied by marriage to the emperor did not guarantee protection. It became the very reason for her downfall. Historians have often noted the irony of Caracalla's public achievements when contrasted with his private brutality. By issuing the Constitutio Antoniniana, he expanded citizenship across the empire, extending rights to millions of people who had previously been excluded from Rome's civic life. Yet, at the same time, he denied the most basic security to his own wife, condemning her to death after years of humiliation and exile. His reforms may have broadened the empire's sense of identity, but his actions at home revealed a ruler driven by paranoia and cruelty. For the Roman people, the story of Plautilla likely reinforced the sense that imperial marriages were dangerous arenas where politics outweighed affection. The empress, often a symbol of continuity and stability, could just as easily become a victim of political purges. Plautilla's fall was not unique in Roman history, but her story remains one of the clearest examples of how quickly a queen could be elevated to prominence only to be cast aside and destroyed. Caracalla himself would not escape the cycle of violence that defined his reign. In 217 CE, while traveling to campaign in the east, he was assassinated by one of his own soldiers. His death ended a turbulent rule, leaving behind a legacy of reforms mixed with memories of cruelty. Plautilla's fate is part of that legacy, a stark reminder of the personal costs hidden within imperial politics. And just as Caracalla's paranoia drove him to destroy his wife, another ruler far to the east, Cambyses II of Persia, would also turn against his queen, a sister wife whose tragic end was recorded by the historian Herodotus, showing that such acts of spousal destruction were not confined to Rome, but were a recurring theme across empires. Cambyses II, Achaemenid Persia. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, ruled the Achaemenid Empire from 530 to 522 BCE. He inherited one of the largest and most prosperous kingdoms of the ancient world, a realm stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. While his father was remembered for relatively tolerant policies and shrewd diplomacy, Cambyses' reign was overshadowed by stories of cruelty, erratic behavior, and paranoia. Among these tales, recorded most famously by the Greek historian Herodotus, is the chilling account of how he killed his sister wife, a union that had bound together dynastic pride and family bloodline. The marriage itself was controversial. The Achaemenid dynasty, like several other royal houses of antiquity, sometimes practiced sibling unions as a way to preserve the purity of the royal line. Cambyses, according to Herodotus, married two of his sisters. While this arrangement shocked Greek writers, it seems to have been tolerated, or at least not unheard of, within Persian royal tradition. To outsiders, however, the practice became symbolic of both Persian exoticism and decadence, adding a moralistic edge to the later stories about Cambyses' downfall. Herodotus recounts that one of Cambyses' sisters offended him by speaking out when he began to act tyrannically. She allegedly reminded him of how he had treated the Egyptian people after his conquest of their land and questioned his cruelty. Cambyses, already portrayed as unstable and intolerant of criticism, was enraged. In his fury, he ordered her death, a command carried out without hesitation by those who feared his wrath. Whether this account reflects historical truth or Greek moralizing exaggeration, it demonstrates how closely royal marriages could become entangled with questions of absolute authority. Modern historians approach Herodotus' account with caution. Greek authors often depicted Persian rulers in highly negative terms, emphasizing excess and moral corruption to contrast with their own ideals of governance. Some suggest that Cambyses may have been the victim of hostile propaganda, with tales of his cruelty exaggerated to serve as a cautionary lesson for Greek audiences. Still, even if details were distorted, the core fact that Cambyses ordered the execution of a royal consort fits into a broader pattern of monarchs, using lethal force within their households to eliminate perceived threats. What makes the story particularly striking is the way it intertwines personal relationships with imperial politics. Cambyses' sister wife was not simply a spouse. She represented continuity within the Achaemenid dynasty and could have been a powerful figure in her own right. Her presence at court lent legitimacy to Cambyses' rule, especially since he lacked the long-established prestige of his father. Yet the same qualities that gave her influence also made her vulnerable. If she dared to challenge the emperor, her words carried weight, and in the volatile environment of the Persian court, any criticism could be interpreted as treason. This episode also reveals the dangerous isolation of monarchs like Cambyses. Surrounded by courtiers too fearful to oppose him, the king had few checks on his temper or decisions. In such a setting, a moment of anger could become a death sentence. The killing of his sister wife, whether motivated by paranoia, pride, or a simple refusal to tolerate dissent, exemplifies how absolute power could twist familial bonds into arenas of suspicion and violence. The consequences of Cambyses' rule extended far beyond his household. After his Egyptian campaign, which was initially successful but later plagued by logistical failures, his reputation suffered. Stories of sacrilegious behavior such as desecrating temples or mocking local traditions circulated widely. Combined with the account of his cruelty toward his own family, these tales painted him as a ruler who had lost control of both his empire and himself. By 522 BCE, Cambyses' reign came to a dramatic end. On his way back from Egypt, he died under mysterious circumstances, possibly from an accidental wound. His sudden death created a power vacuum that led to the rise of Darius I, one of the greatest kings of Persia. The contrast between Cambyses' chaotic rule and Darius's more stable governance further reinforced the image of Cambyses as a tyrant undone by his own flaws. For later generations, the story of Cambyses and his sister wife became more than just a historical anecdote. It was retold as a moral parable about the dangers of unchecked power and the corruption that absolute authority could breed. Whether or not every detail from Herodotus is accurate, the broader lesson remains powerful. In the hands of rulers who allowed anger and suspicion to override reason, even the closest bonds of kinship could be severed in the most brutal fashion. The tragedy of Cambyses' marriage echoes across the stories of other monarchs. It shows how queens and consorts, even those tied by blood to their husbands, were never safe when political insecurity and personal paranoia ruled the throne. And while Persia had its share of tragic royal unions, the same pattern can be found in the kingdoms bordering the Black Sea. Mithridates VI of Pontus, another ambitious and ruthless monarch, would also turn against his wives, ordering their deaths when he suspected betrayal, proving that this grim motif of kings killing queens was not confined to any one empire, but stretched across the ancient world. Mithridates VI of Pontus. Mithridates VI of Pontus, known to history as Mithridates the Great, ruled the kingdom of Pontus in northern Anatolia from 120 to 63 BCE. He was one of Rome's fiercest enemies, remembered for leading 3 major wars against the Republic and for orchestrating the infamous massacre of tens of thousands of Romans and Italians in Asia Minor. Yet beyond his military brilliance and political cunning, Mithridates' reign was marked by extraordinary cruelty within his own household. Like many kings who allowed paranoia and ambition to govern their personal lives, he turned against the women closest to him, including his wives and concubines. The deaths of these women, particularly his queen Monime, reveal the darker side of a ruler celebrated for his defiance against Rome. Mithridates rose to power in a volatile region, where alliances shifted rapidly and survival depended on a ruler's ability to command loyalty and instill fear. From the beginning, he cultivated an image of both genius and ruthlessness. He was renowned for his ability to speak numerous languages, his physical endurance, and his calculated resistance to Roman power. But within his palace, that same ruthlessness made him a dangerous husband. One of the most poignant stories involves Monime, a Greek woman celebrated for her beauty and intelligence. According to ancient sources such as Plutarch and Appian, Mithridates sought her hand and tried to win her favor with lavish gifts, including a diadem symbolizing queenship. Monime, however, initially resisted his advances, wary of being drawn into the dangerous world of dynastic politics. Mithridates, determined to make her his wife, ultimately compelled her into marriage. For a brief time, she occupied a position of influence in his court, but the relationship was far from secure. The problem lay not only in Mithridates' volatile personality, but also in the broader context of his wars against Rome. As pressure mounted on the Pontic king, he became increasingly suspicious of everyone around him. Even family members were not safe from his paranoia. Ancient accounts suggest that Monime, once adored, fell victim to these suspicions. In the wake of military defeats and growing instability, Mithridates ordered her death, along with that of other royal women. The method of her execution varies across sources, but the consensus is clear. She was condemned because the king believed she could no longer be trusted, or because her continued existence might embolden rivals. Monime was not the only casualty. Other wives and concubines of Mithridates are recorded as having met similar fates, especially during the later stages of his reign, when his grip on power began to weaken. Facing betrayal from allies and even his own children, Mithridates lashed out at those within his immediate household. In this way, his palace became as much a battlefield as the frontiers where he fought the Romans. The irony of Mithridates' story lies in the contrast between his external and internal struggles. To his subjects and supporters, he was a symbol of resistance against the growing power of Rome. His campaigns inspired admiration among those who longed for independence from Roman domination. Yet, within the walls of his palace, he created an atmosphere of fear, where love and loyalty were overshadowed by suspicion. His wives, who should have been symbols of stability and continuity, became victims of the very insecurities that plagued his rule. The death of Monime, in particular, left a strong impression on ancient historians, who used her story to illustrate the human cost of Mithridates' ambition. Her fate was a reminder that queens, no matter how intelligent or virtuous, were vulnerable when their husbands viewed them as liabilities. In the eyes of Mithridates, preserving power outweighed preserving life, even when it came to those closest to him. Mithridates' cruelty toward his wives mirrors a pattern seen throughout history. Rulers consumed by paranoia often destroyed the very people who could have supported them most. His decision to eliminate Monime and others did not strengthen his position in the long run. Instead, it further eroded the loyalty of his household and alienated potential allies. By the time of his final confrontation with Rome, Mithridates was a ruler increasingly isolated, mistrusted not only by foreign powers but also by his own family. The legacy of Mithridates VI is thus twofold. On one hand, he is remembered as a brilliant strategist and one of Rome's most formidable adversaries. On the other, he embodies the tragic flaw of many absolute monarchs, the inability to separate personal fears from political necessity. His cruelty toward his wives reflects the destructive potential of unchecked power, where suspicion could transform intimacy into enmity and marriage into a death sentence. For centuries, playwrights, poets, and historians retold the story of Mithridates and Monime, fascinated by the mixture of grandeur and cruelty. To some, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of loving a tyrant. To others, it symbolized the way ambition corrodes even the most personal of bonds. As the wars of Mithridates came to an end and Rome triumphed, his personal tragedies were woven into the larger narrative of his downfall. His legacy reminds us that kings who ruled by fear often destroyed not only their enemies but also their families. And while Mithridates' household was torn apart by suspicion, similar tragedies unfolded in China centuries later. During the Tang dynasty, Emperor Xuanzong, caught in the turmoil of the An-Lushan rebellion, made the heartbreaking decision to order the death of his beloved consort, Yang Guifei, another example of how political survival could demand the ultimate personal sacrifice. Tang Emperor Xuanzong. The Tang dynasty, 618–907 CE, is often described as a golden age of Chinese civilization. It was an era of cultural brilliance, economic prosperity, and territorial expansion. Among its emperors, Tang Xuanzong, who reigned from 712 to 756 CE Street, stands out for presiding over both the height of Tang power and the beginning of its decline. Xuanzong's early reign was marked by capable governance and flourishing arts, but his later years were consumed by indulgence, political weakness, and the catastrophic An-Lushan rebellion. At the center of his personal story lies one of the most famous tragedies in Chinese history: the execution of his beloved consort, Yang Guifei, in 756 CE, during a moment of national crisis. Yang Guifei, whose personal name was Yang Yuhuan, was celebrated as one of the four beauties of ancient China. She captivated the emperor with her charm, grace, and musical talent. Xuanzong elevated her to the position of guifei, or highest-ranking consort, granting her unprecedented influence at court. For years, their relationship was a source of both admiration and controversy. Poets sang of their romance, painting it as a union of passion and tenderness, while critics accused Xuanzong of neglecting state affairs in his devotion to her. Their story took a dramatic turn with the rise of An-Lushan, a general of non-Han origin who amassed significant military power. An-Lushan enjoyed favor at court, and some sources suggest he was even treated with familiarity by Yang Guifei and her family. Over time, however, his ambitions grew dangerous. In 755 CE, he launched a massive rebellion against the Tang, plunging the empire into chaos. Xuanzong, caught off guard, fled the capital of Chang'an with his court, including Yang Guifei, as An-Lushan's forces advanced. It was during this desperate flight that tragedy struck. As the imperial entourage retreated to the relative safety of Sichuan, discontent grew among the soldiers. They blamed Yang Guifei and her family for the corruption and mismanagement that had allowed An-Lushan's rebellion to gain momentum. Her relatives had been granted high offices and wielded great influence, leading many to accuse them of weakening the state. The soldiers, exhausted and fearful, demanded that someone be held accountable. Xuanzong faced a terrible dilemma. He loved Yang Guifei deeply, yet he also knew his army would not support him unless he acted decisively. To preserve his throne and prevent mutiny, he reluctantly agreed to their demands. At Mawei Station, near today's Xingping in Shaanxi province, Yang Guifei was ordered to die. Ancient records emphasize the emperor's grief, describing him as unable to bear the sight but forced to consent for the sake of survival. Yang Guifei's death marked a turning point in both Xuanzong's reign and Tang history. For the emperor personally, it was the loss of his most cherished companion, a wound that would haunt him in his later years. He abdicated in favor of his son shortly after and spent the remainder of his life in relative obscurity, overshadowed by the disasters of his final years in power. For the Tang dynasty, the An-Lushan rebellion marked the beginning of decline. Though the dynasty would endure for another century and a half, it never fully recovered its former strength. The story of Xuanzong and Yang Guifei became immortalized in Chinese literature. Poets like Bai Juyi composed masterpieces such as The Song of Everlasting Sorrow, which portrayed their love as transcendent yet doomed by fate. In these works, Yang Guifei is remembered not merely as a political scapegoat, but as a symbol of tragic romance, a woman whose beauty and charm enchanted an emperor, but who ultimately paid with her life when the empire faltered. Historians, meanwhile, view the episode as a stark example of how rulers' personal relationships could intertwine with state affairs, sometimes with disastrous consequences. Xuanzong's devotion to Yang Guifei may not have directly caused the rebellion, but the perception that her family wielded undue influence eroded confidence in his leadership. In a moment of crisis, the demands of governance and military discipline outweighed the bonds of affection, and the emperor chose the survival of his dynasty over the life of his consort. What makes this episode particularly poignant is the contrast between Xuanzong's early reign and its tragic end. As a young ruler, he had been praised for his diligence and reforms, ushering in what historians call the Kaiyuan Golden Age. Yet in his later years, he became associated with indulgence, weakness, and the downfall brought by An-Lushan's revolt. Yang Guifei, by virtue of her closeness to him, came to embody both his greatest joys and his deepest failures. Her fate also highlights the precariousness of life at court. Even the most exalted position, being the beloved of the emperor, offered no protection when politics turned hostile. For Yang Guifei, adoration from the ruler and admiration from poets could not shield her from the soldier's wrath or the emperor's reluctant decision. Her death illustrates the broader truth that queens and consorts, though often influential, were vulnerable in times of crisis, their lives subject to the same calculations of power that governed wars and rebellions. The tale of Tang Xuanzong and Yang Guifei continues to resonate because it combines romance, politics, and tragedy in a single narrative. It reminds us that rulers, even those who presided over golden ages, were human beings torn between love and duty, often forced to make choices that left scars on both their hearts and their legacies. And as China mourned the loss of its most celebrated consort, another story from the Tang dynasty unfolded. Decades earlier, Emperor Gaozong had presided over a court where rivalries among empresses and concubines turned deadly, and the fates of Empress Wang and consort Zhao would reveal once again how imperial women were caught in the lethal crosscurrents of power. Tang, Emperor, Gaozong. The Tang dynasty is often remembered as one of China's most illustrious periods, marked by cultural brilliance, international trade along the Silk Road, and the flowering of poetry, art, and philosophy. But within the imperial court, the lives of queens and consorts were fraught with peril. Tang Emperor Gaozong, who reigned from 649 to 683 CE, presided over one of the most dramatic and consequential episodes in Chinese history, in which palace politics turned deadly. The downfall of Empress Wang and consort Zhao, both executed in 655 CE, illustrates how imperial women could be destroyed not only by the will of the emperor, but also by the machinations of powerful rivals, in this case, Wu Zhao, the woman who would later become Empress Wu Zetian, China's only female sovereign. Gaozong was the son of Emperor Taizong, one of the greatest Tang rulers, and he inherited the throne in 649 CE. Unlike his formidable father, Gaozong is often described by historians as mild-mannered and somewhat indecisive. His reign saw territorial expansion and internal stability, yet within the palace, his gentleness became a vulnerability. He relied heavily on his wife, Empress Wang, and later on his favored consort, Wu Zhao, who would gradually dominate court affairs. At the start of Gaozong's reign, Empress Wang held the highest position in the harem. She was respected for her dignity and for her ability to maintain harmony within the palace. However, her failure to produce a son weakened her position, leaving her vulnerable in a society that prized male heirs. At the same time, Gaozong's affections began to shift toward Wu Zhao, a concubine who had previously served his father. Wu Zhao was intelligent, ambitious, and politically astute, and she quickly rose in influence. Gaozong became increasingly attached to her, which inevitably placed Empress Wang in a precarious situation. Consort Zhao, another high-ranking woman in the palace, further complicated matters. Like Empress Wang, she also held the emperor's favor, and she too lacked a son. Both women saw Wu Zhao's rise as a threat, but they underestimated her resolve. Wu Zhao was not content to remain a favored concubine. She sought to become empress herself, an ambition that would require the removal of her two rivals. In 654 CE, Wu Zhao gave birth to a daughter, and this moment provided her with an opportunity to discredit Empress Wang. According to later chronicles, the infant died under mysterious circumstances, and Wu Zhao accused Empress Wang of having harmed the child out of jealousy. Whether or not the story is true, or whether it was a fabrication to justify action, the accusation was devastating. Gaozong, swayed by Wu Zhao's influence, began to turn against Empress Wang. The emperor soon faced pressure to depose Wang and elevate Wu Zhao in her place. Court officials were divided, with some warning against breaking with tradition and others supporting Wu Zhao's ascension. Ultimately, Gaozong sided with Wu Zhao, and in 655 CE, Empress Wang was stripped of her title. But deposition was not enough. Both Wang and consort Zhao were accused of witchcraft and other crimes, charges that carried the weight of treason within the Tang legal system. Convicted under these accusations, the two women were executed. The executions of Empress Wang and consort Zhao were turning points in Gaozong's reign. They not only cleared the way for Wu Zhao to become empress, but also demonstrated the emperor's willingness to sanction lethal measures against women who had once been closest to him. Although Wu Zhao orchestrated much of the intrigue, Gaozong's authority was ultimately the mechanism through which judgment was carried out. By allowing the deaths of his wife and consort, he confirmed that imperial women, regardless of their titles, could be sacrificed when power shifted. For Gaozong himself, the episode revealed both his vulnerability and his dependence on Wu Zhao. From that point onward, she became the true power behind the throne, guiding policies and making key decisions. After Gaozong's death, Wu Zhao would go on to rule in her own name as Empress Wu Zetian, a remarkable yet controversial figure who reshaped the Tang dynasty. The tragedy of Empress Wang and consort Zhao demonstrates the fragility of status within the imperial palace. Their downfall was not due to disloyalty or incompetence, but to the ambitions of a rival and the emperor's readiness to endorse her rise. Their executions remind us that the bonds of marriage and affection could be swiftly severed when political survival was at stake. For later historians and poets, this story served as both a cautionary tale and a dramatic prelude to Wu Zetian's unprecedented reign. While Wu is remembered as a powerful and capable ruler, the path she took to the throne was paved with the downfall of other women, whose stories have often been overshadowed by her own. Gaozong's legacy, therefore, is inseparable from this tragedy. Though he was not the most aggressive or tyrannical of emperors, his compliance in the deaths of Empress Wang and consort Zhao shows how rulers could allow personal relationships to be manipulated by court intrigue. The result was the destruction of two women whose only crime was standing in the way of an ambitious rival. The execution of Empress Wang and consort Zhao illustrates a theme that recurs across history. Queens and consorts, despite their exalted positions, lived under constant threat. Their survival depended not only on their own conduct, but also on the emperor's whims and the rivalries of the court. And while the Tang dynasty provides one of the most dramatic examples of palace intrigue, the dangers were not confined to China. Centuries later, in Ming China, another emperor, the Jiajing emperor, would order the deaths of palace women after discovering a conspiracy against him, demonstrating once again how fragile life could be for imperial consorts when suspicion and power collided. Jiajing Emperor, Ming China. The Ming dynasty, which lasted from 1368 to 1644, was one of China's most powerful and influential eras. It was marked by impressive achievements in art, architecture, and governance, but also by intense court intrigues, factional struggles, and frequent conflicts within the imperial household. Among the Ming emperors, Zhu Hukong, better known as the Jiajing Emperor, who reigned from 1521 to 1567, was particularly notorious for his aloofness, obsession with Taoist rituals, and reliance on a rigid system of palace control. His reign was long and, in some respects, prosperous, but his personal relationships with palace women were overshadowed by suspicion and violence. The most infamous episode came in 1542 with what historians call the Renyan Palace Plot, a failed assassination attempt that led to the executions of numerous consorts, including his once beloved consort Duan and concubine Ning. The Jiajing emperor ascended the throne in unusual circumstances. He was not the direct heir of the previous emperor, but was chosen as a cousin from a cadet branch of the imperial family. From the beginning, his legitimacy was contested, and he responded by carefully consolidating authority and leaning heavily on rituals to reinforce his divine mandate. Over time, he withdrew from daily governance, leaving much of the administrative burden to grand secretaries and eunuchs, while he immersed himself in Taoist practices. His quest for immortality consumed much of his attention, and he became increasingly reclusive, spending long periods in ritual seclusion. Life in the palace under Jiajing was harsh. He was known for enforcing strict discipline over the harem, and his demands for ritual purity often extended to the women around him. At the same time, his temper and suspicion made the palace a dangerous environment. Even a favored consort could fall from grace overnight if accused of disloyalty or misconduct. This precarious atmosphere culminated in the Renyan Palace Plot. According to historical accounts, in the early morning hours of October 1542, a group of palace women conspired to kill the emperor while he slept. The plot arose out of years of mistreatment and resentment, as many concubines felt trapped in a life of neglect and fear. The conspirators attempted to strangle the emperor with a silken cord, but the attack failed. Some accounts say that the cord was tied too loosely. Others suggest that one of the women panicked and betrayed the plan. In any case, the emperor survived, and the consequences were swift and devastating. The Jiajing emperor, furious and shaken, ordered a thorough investigation. The plotters were interrogated, and confessions were extracted. Dozens of women were implicated, not only those who had taken part in the attempt, but also those who were accused of knowing about it and failing to report it. Among the condemned were consort Duan, who had once been one of the emperor's favorites, and concubine Ning, whose involvement may have been exaggerated or fabricated to justify her elimination. Both women were executed, their positions and past affection offering no shield against the emperor's wrath. The executions following the Renyan Palace Plot underscore the fragility of life within the Ming harem. Consorts who had once been celebrated and favored were destroyed almost overnight, their names forever associated with treason. The fact that the conspiracy arose at all reflects the atmosphere of fear and discontent that pervaded the palace. For many of these women, their only chance at agency lay in desperate acts, and when those acts failed, they paid the ultimate price. The Jiajing emperor himself emerged from the plot even more suspicious and withdrawn. Rather than reflecting on his governance or the conditions that had provoked such discontent, he interpreted the event as proof of the need for greater control. He tightened his grip on the palace and became even more immersed in Taoist practices, seeking protection through rituals rather than reform. His reign continued for another 25 years, but the scars of the Renyan Palace Plot lingered, a reminder that even the most powerful emperor was vulnerable in his own bedchamber. For historians, the episode provides a vivid illustration of how palace life was both gilded and perilous. The women of the Ming court lived in extraordinary luxury, but they also endured intense scrutiny and confinement. Their fates were tied to the emperor's moods, the shifting alliances among eunuchs, and the whisperings of rivals. The executions of consort Duan and concubine Ning reflect how quickly favor could turn into fatal condemnation. Literature and folklore later seized on the tragedy of the Renyan Palace Plot, often portraying the executed women with a degree of sympathy. They became symbols of the dangers of unchecked imperial authority and the tragic costs borne by women who lived within the palace walls. The story also reinforced the moral lesson that emperors who ruled through fear and neglect sowed discontent even in their most intimate circles. The Jiajing emperor's reign stands as a paradox. On one hand, China remained relatively stable, with its borders secure and its economy thriving. On the other, his personal detachment and reliance on ritual left a legacy of weakened governance and palace intrigue. His decision to execute consorts, including those he had once cherished, shows how power could warp personal bonds and transform affection into suspicion. And while the Ming court was scarred by this episode, elsewhere in the Byzantine Empire, a ruler would enact a similarly ruthless purge within his palace. Andronikos, I Komnenos, known for his cruelty and ambition, would order the death of Empress Maria of Antioch, proving once again that across cultures and centuries, queens could become victims of kings when politics and paranoia collided. Andronikos, I Komnenos, Byzantium. Byzantine history is filled with tales of grandeur, intrigue, and betrayal, and few emperors embody this combination more vividly than Andronikos I Komnenos. Ruling from 1183 to 1185 CE, he came to power during a period of internal instability, when the once mighty Byzantine Empire was struggling with corruption, external threats, and a fractious aristocracy. Andronikos, known for his charisma and ruthlessness, sought to impose reform and strengthen the imperial throne, but his reign quickly descended into tyranny. One of the darkest moments of his rule was the execution of Empress Maria of Antioch, the widowed consort of his predecessor and regent for the young emperor Alexios II. Her death at Andronikos' command not only shocked Constantinople, but also revealed the deadly stakes of palace politics. Maria of Antioch was the daughter of Constans of Antioch and had married Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, one of the most respected Byzantine rulers of the 12th century. After Manuel's death in 1180, the throne passed to his son, Alexios II, who was still a minor. Maria became regent, tasked with guiding the empire during her son's youth. This position made her immensely powerful, but also vulnerable. As a Latin princess in a Greek-dominated empire, she was viewed with suspicion by many, and her reliance on advisors of Western origin deepened resentment within Constantinople. Andronikos Komnenos, a cousin of Manuel, seized upon this discontent to further his own ambitions. Charismatic and skilled in both politics and military affairs, he had lived much of his life in exile, marked by scandalous adventures and a reputation for both charm and cruelty. By the early 1182s, he returned to the capital, presenting himself as a reformer, determined to end corruption and protect the young emperor. To many citizens weary of mismanagement, he seemed a savior, but his rise to power would prove disastrous for those who stood in his way. Maria of Antioch, as regent, was one of his chief obstacles. Her Western connections, coupled with her role as guardian of Alexios II, threatened Andronikos' ambitions to control the throne. Rumors and propaganda began to circulate, accusing her of corruption, mismanagement, and even betrayal of Byzantine interests to the Latins. These charges, whether grounded in fact or deliberately fabricated, served Andronikos' purpose to undermine her legitimacy and prepare the ground for her removal. In 1182, Andronikos entered Constantinople with popular support, capitalizing on the growing resentment against Latin influence. Riots erupted in the capital, leading to the infamous massacre of Latins, an event that further destabilized the empire's reputation abroad. Amid this turmoil, Maria's position became untenable. She was arrested, accused of plotting against Andronikos, and condemned. Contemporary accounts describe how she was strangled in prison, a grim end for a woman who had once been empress and regent of Byzantium. The execution of Maria of Antioch was not simply a personal act of cruelty, it was a calculated political maneuver. By eliminating her, Andronikos removed a rival regent and cleared the way to control the young Alexios II. Shortly thereafter, Alexios himself would also be eliminated, reportedly strangled on Andronikos' orders, allowing Andronikos to claim the throne outright. These actions underscored his determination to consolidate power, regardless of the human cost. Andronikos initially attempted to rule as a reformer. He cracked down on corruption, curbed the power of the aristocracy, and sought to restore order. Yet his reforms were implemented with such harshness that they alienated the very society he sought to stabilize. His paranoia deepened as conspiracies against him multiplied, and his rule devolved into tyranny. Those who opposed him were ruthlessly punished, often through brutal methods meant to instill fear. The death of Maria of Antioch remains one of the most striking examples of how imperial women could be sacrificed to political ambition. As a queen and regent, she embodied continuity and legitimacy. But those very qualities made her a threat to Andronikos. Her downfall highlights the precarious position of royal widows in Byzantine politics. Respected while their sons were young, but increasingly vulnerable as male relatives sought to seize power for themselves. For the Byzantine populace, Maria's death may have been overshadowed by the wider turmoil of the period, but for historians, it stands as a symbol of Andronikos' ruthless consolidation of power. It reveals how personal ambition and political calculation could override loyalty to family, dynasty, or tradition. Andronikos' own reign ended in violence. In 1185, after a failed attempt to repel a Norman invasion and amid widespread resentment of his tyranny, the people of Constantinople turned against him. He was captured, tortured, and executed in one of the most dramatic downfalls in Byzantine history. His rise and fall serve as a reminder that cruelty may secure power in the short term, but it often breeds the very instability it seeks to prevent. The story of Andronikos and Maria of Antioch, however, is more than a tale of personal betrayal. It is part of a broader pattern in which rulers eliminated wives, consorts, and regents to secure their positions. Across the world in Korea, during the Joseon dynasty, King Sukjong would make a similarly fateful decision, ordering the death of his consort Jang Hui-bin, a woman who had once been his great love, but who ultimately became a casualty of court intrigue and the struggle for legitimacy. King Sukjong of Joseon, Korea. The Joseon dynasty of Korea, 1392–1897, is remembered for its rigid Confucian order, scholarly achievements, and remarkable endurance over 5 centuries. Yet within its royal palaces, life was rarely serene. Court factions competed bitterly for influence, and the lives of queens and royal consorts often hung in the balance of these rivalries. King Sukjong, who reigned from 1674 to 1720, presided over one of the most politically turbulent reigns of the dynasty. His legacy is inseparable from the rise and fall of his beloved consort, Jang Hui-bin, who was executed in 1701 under his direct orders. Sukjong was a capable ruler who sought to balance the competing political factions that shaped Joseon's governance. The Westerners, Soing, and Southerners, Namin, later joined by other splinter groups. Rather than remaining loyal to one side, he often shifted his favor strategically, ensuring that no single faction could dominate. This constant reshuffling of power allowed him to maintain control, but also created instability, as court officials lived in fear of sudden reversals. Against this backdrop, royal consorts were more than companions. They were deeply entangled in factional politics, as their families and supporters used their positions to advance influence. Jiang Huibin, born Jiang Okejong, entered the palace as a concubine and quickly won Sukjong's heart. Renowned for her beauty and charm, she became one of the most famous figures in Korean history. Through Sukjong's favor, she rose rapidly in rank, eventually becoming queen in 1689 after the deposition of Queen In-hyun. This dramatic shift was not just a matter of personal affection. It reflected the political dominance of the Southerners, who supported Jiang Huibin's elevation. However, the wheel of fortune in Joseon politics never stopped turning. By 1694, Sukjong realigned himself with the Western faction, restoring Queen In-hyun to her position and demoting Jiang Huibin back to consort. This reversal left Jiang and her allies vulnerable, and her reputation suffered. Yet Sukjong still maintained affection for her, and she continued to wield influence in the palace, even as the reinstated queen regained formal authority. The tragedy came to a head in 1701, when Queen In-hyun fell gravely ill and died. Rumors spread quickly that Jiang Huibin and her supporters had engaged in sorcery to bring about the queen's death. In a deeply Confucian society that took accusations of witchcraft seriously, these charges were devastating. Whether true or fabricated, they provided Sukjong with justification to act against Jiang. Torn between past love and present duty, the king ordered her execution. Jiang Huibin's death marked one of the most famous episodes of Joseon court history. To many, it illustrated the danger of ambition within the palace walls, where a woman who had once been queen could fall so low. To others, it showed the cruelty of a system where the fates of royal consorts depended not only on their conduct, but also on the shifting winds of factional politics. Jiang Huibin's story has since been immortalized in countless novels, dramas, and films, making her one of Korea's most enduring historical figures. For King Sukjong, the execution was both a political necessity and a personal tragedy. By condemning Jiang, he demonstrated that he would not allow even his closest companions to undermine royal dignity or stability. Yet the act also revealed the human cost of his balancing strategy, which relied on raising and destroying individuals to preserve his authority. His reign remained one of the longest and most complex in Joseon history, but it carried the shadow of Jiang Huibin's fate. Her story echoes the broader theme we have seen across cultures. Queens and consorts, despite their exalted status, lived under constant threat. Their power made them indispensable yet expendable, adored one moment and condemned the next. And while Jiang Huibin's fall shocked Korea, far to the west in Safavid Iran, another king, Shah Safi, would act with similar ruthlessness, turning against his wife in an act of sudden and deadly violence that underscored the perilous lives of royal consorts. Shah Safi, Safavid Iran. The Safavid dynasty, 1501–1736, was one of the great Persian empires, remembered for consolidating Shia Islam as the state religion, fostering art and architecture, and competing for supremacy with the Ottoman and Mughal empires. Within its splendid courts, however, power was often accompanied by suspicion, and royal households could be scenes of sudden cruelty. Shah Safi, who reigned from 1629 to 1642, is often described by historians as a ruler overshadowed by his grandfather, Shah Abbas the Great. Whereas Abbas was celebrated for his vision and energy, Safi became infamous for his violent temper and reckless decisions. Among his most notorious acts was the killing of one of his wives, an episode that revealed his volatile nature and the dangers of life in the Safavid harem. Safi inherited the throne at a young age, following the death of his grandfather Abbas I. Unlike his predecessor, who had carefully cultivated an image of authority and reform, Safi was less disciplined and more impulsive. He relied heavily on court advisors and eunuchs, but his reign was marked by bouts of suspicion, extravagance, and instability. To consolidate power, he engaged in widespread purges of the nobility and the royal family, eliminating anyone he perceived as a threat. His actions, often carried out suddenly and violently, reflected both his insecurity and his attempt to establish himself as an unquestioned ruler. The Safavid harem, though a place of luxury, was also a center of politics. Royal wives and concubines came from prominent families, both Persian and foreign, and their positions carried significant political weight. A consort could represent an alliance with a noble house or a foreign ruler, and thus her status was often tied to wider political dynamics. Yet this influence also made them vulnerable. If a Shah grew suspicious or if a consort's family fell out of favor, her life could be at risk. Shah Safi's marriage to one of his wives, her name, unfortunately, is not preserved in all sources, ended in tragedy. Chroniclers report that during a fit of rage, Safi stabbed her to death. The circumstances are vague, but the act was remembered as a sign of his reckless temper. It was not a calculated political execution like those carried out by other rulers, but rather a sudden outburst of violence that shocked the court. Such behavior undermined his legitimacy, for a ruler who could not control his emotions was seen as incapable of maintaining harmony in the empire. This episode is significant because it illustrates a different kind of royal uxoricide. Whereas some kings condemned their wives for alleged treason, sorcery, or political rivalry, Safi's act appears to have been impulsive, the product of a volatile temperament rather than a carefully plotted purge. Yet the outcome was the same. A consort who had once shared the ruler's favor was destroyed by the very man who had elevated her. For the Safavid court, the killing deepened the atmosphere of fear. Nobles, eunuchs, and consorts alike understood that their lives depended on the Shah's moods. Safi's unpredictability destabilized the balance of power within the palace, eroding trust and creating an environment where loyalty was fragile. Historians generally regard Safi's reign as a period of decline compared to the achievements of Abbas the Great. His erratic behavior, combined with external pressures from the Ottomans and Uzbeks, weakened the empire. Yet his personal acts of cruelty, such as the killing of his wife, became part of his legacy, remembered as examples of how unchecked power could lead to destructive impulses. The story of Shah Safi underscores the broader pattern we have seen in many monarchies. Royal wives, despite their importance, could become victims of suspicion, paranoia, or sudden anger. Their lives, lived in luxury, were also lived in peril. And while Safi's violence marked the Safavid court, the dynasty's troubles did not end with him. His successor, Shah Abbas II, would also be remembered for turning against the women of his household in moments of cruelty, showing that the cycle of peril for royal consorts continued across generations. Shah Abbas II, Safavid Iran. The Safavid dynasty, which had risen to prominence in Persia by establishing Shia Islam as the state religion, reached both glittering heights and troubling lows through its rulers. Among them, Shah Abbas II, who reigned from 1642 to 1666, inherited an empire still strong from the accomplishments of his great-grandfather, Shah Abbas I. Yet his reign is remembered with a mixture of admiration and unease. On one hand, Abbas II was capable, interested in the arts, and maintained stability in a region contested by powerful neighbors. On the other, his court was also marked by episodes of shocking cruelty, including the burning alive of women from his harem. This episode, though clouded by varying historical details, illustrates the dangers of absolute power and the precarious position of royal consorts. Abbas II became Shah at a young age, succeeding his father, Shah Safi, who had left behind a troubled legacy. Unlike Safi, Abbas was better educated and showed interest in governance. He sought to reassert control over the nobility, strengthen the military, and encourage trade. His reign is often viewed as a period of relative revival, particularly in comparison to the turbulence under Safi. Yet, even as he projected competence in external affairs, his household revealed a darker side. The Safavid harem was vast, containing not only wives of noble lineage, but also numerous concubines drawn from across the empire and beyond. Women in the harem were not simply companions. They symbolized alliances, wealth, and prestige. The Shah's treatment of them reflected both his personal temperament and his understanding of royal authority. In Abbas II's case, chroniclers record moments of indulgence, but also incidents of terrifying violence. One of the most notorious accounts describes Abbas II ordering the burning alive of several slave wives, sometimes described as concubines, in response to alleged disobedience or misconduct. The details vary depending on the source, and some later writers may have amplified the horror to emphasize the Shah's brutality. Nonetheless, the consistency of reports suggests that such an event did occur and that Abbas II did not hesitate to use extreme punishment within his own household. This act stands out not only for its cruelty but also for its impulsiveness. Unlike calculated political executions meant to remove rivals or consolidate power, Abbas II's punishment of his wives was sudden and personal. It demonstrated the lethal intersection of royal authority and unchecked anger. In the insulated world of the palace, where the Shah's word was law, even minor transgressions could provoke fatal consequences. For the women of the Safavid court, this reality meant that their lives were lived under constant uncertainty. They might enjoy luxury, influence, and proximity to power, but they also lived with the knowledge that their positions were fragile. A shift in the Shah's mood could mean the difference between favor and destruction. Abbas II's violence toward his wives thus reinforced a climate of fear within the palace, reminding everyone that affection offered no protection against royal wrath. Yet Abbas II's reign cannot be reduced to cruelty alone. He was an active patron of architecture and the arts, supporting the flourishing of Persian miniature painting and literature. His foreign policy was cautious but effective, maintaining a balance between the Ottomans to the west and the Mughals to the east. Still, the memory of his brutality within the palace cast a shadow over these achievements. It revealed that even rulers who appeared competent in public governance could succumb to destructive impulses in their private lives. The story of Abbas II and his wives fits into the broader pattern of monarchs who turned against those closest to them. It demonstrates how the absolute authority of kings left no room for resistance or appeal. For historians, such episodes raise questions about how power shapes human behavior, turning personal relationships into dangerous tests of loyalty and survival. Abbas II's violent actions remind us that history often blends light and shadow. He maintained the empire's stability and contributed to its cultural richness, but his cruelty toward the women of his household is inseparable from his legacy. It illustrates once again the central theme of our journey: the vulnerability of queens and consorts in the face of royal suspicion and rage. And while Abbas II's brutality shocked the Safavid court, similar tragedies unfolded in Judea centuries earlier. Herod the Great, already infamous for the execution of Mariamne I, would continue his pattern of violence by condemning other royal women tied to him by marriage, further proving that power and paranoia often destroyed the very families rulers were meant to protect. Herod the Great, again, Judea. Herod the Great, who ruled Judea from 37 to 4 BCE, has already appeared in this narrative for the execution of his queen, Mariamne I. Yet his story does not end there. In addition to Mariamne, Herod ordered the deaths of several other women within his extended household, demonstrating how his paranoia deepened over time and how royal women remained vulnerable even after his most famous act of cruelty. Josephus, the principal ancient source for Herod's reign, describes a pattern of suspicion and violence that engulfed not only Mariamne but also her relatives and other consorts tied to Herod by blood or marriage. After Mariamne's execution, Herod's grief was intense, yet it did not lead to reflection or restraint. Instead, his paranoia about threats to his throne grew stronger. He increasingly viewed the Hasmonean family, the dynasty into which Mariamne had been born, as a danger to his legitimacy. Though his marriage to Mariamne had initially been intended to strengthen his claim by uniting the Herodian and Hasmonean lines, it had the opposite effect. Herod came to fear that sympathizers of the Hasmoneans might use Mariamne's children or relatives as figureheads in plots against him. As a result, Herod carried out a series of purges. He executed Mariamne's mother, Alexandra, after accusing her of conspiring with Cleopatra of Egypt. Other female relatives of the Hasmonean house also fell victim to his suspicions. In these cases, the women were not merely passive figures but symbolic threats, their very bloodlines representing rival claims to power. By eliminating them, Herod sought to erase any potential challenge to his authority. These actions reveal the broader logic of Herod's reign. He was a king placed on the throne with Roman backing, ruling over a people who often saw him as an outsider. His legitimacy was fragile, and he attempted to shore it up through marriages, alliances, and monumental building projects. Yet at the same time, his insecurities made him prone to violence against those closest to him. His paranoia turned his family into targets, and women who should have symbolized dynastic continuity instead became casualties of his fear. Herod's later years were marked by further acts of cruelty. Ancient sources describe how he even turned against his own sons by Mariamne, fearing they might plot against him. While their cases extend beyond the focus on wives, they demonstrate the same destructive pattern. Suspicion eroded familial bonds, and Herod's reign became defined as much by bloodshed within his household as by his grand public works. For the people of Judea, these acts reinforced the perception of Herod as both powerful and dangerous. On one hand, he was admired for his architectural achievements and his ability to maintain relative stability under Roman oversight. On the other, he was feared for his ruthlessness, particularly toward his own family. His reputation in Jewish tradition and later in Christian writings often highlighted this darker side, portraying him as a ruler whose ambition and insecurity destroyed those closest to him. The continuation of Herod's violence against women in his household reminds us that Mariamne's fate was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a larger pattern in which Herod's insecurities repeatedly overrode affection, loyalty, and kinship. His treatment of Mariamne and her relatives shows how the intersection of politics and family life could become deadly under absolute monarchy. Herod's legacy thus remains deeply ambivalent. He built great monuments that still stand today, such as the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, yet his name is equally associated with the destruction of his own family. His repeated executions of royal women highlight the fragility of queenship in a world where marriage to a king could be both a path to influence and a sentence of death. And just as Judea reeled under Herod's paranoia, Rome would soon witness similar patterns of cruelty. Commodus, remembered as one of the most notorious emperors of the late Roman Empire, would eventually turn against his sister and consort Lucilla, ordering her death after she was accused of plotting against him, another chilling example of how even family bonds could not withstand imperial suspicion. Commodus Rome. The reign of Commodus, who ruled Rome from 180 to 192 CE, is often remembered as the turning point when the empire's fortunes began to decline. He was the son of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, whose reign is still celebrated for its wisdom and stability. Yet Commodus could not have been more different from his father. Where Marcus was admired for restraint, Commodus became infamous for self-indulgence, cruelty, and a flair for spectacle. His decisions not only destabilized the empire, but also scarred his personal relationships, including his brutal treatment of members of his own household. One of the most notorious examples was his order to execute his sister Lucilla, who had once been empress as the wife of Marcus Aurelius's co-ruler, Lucius Verus. Lucilla was a woman of considerable influence. As the daughter of Marcus Aurelius and Faustina the Younger, she was a central figure in Rome's imperial family. Through her marriage to Lucius Verus, she held the title of Augusta, giving her both prestige and visibility in Roman politics. After Verus's death in 169 CE, she retained her status and was later remarried for political reasons. However, her importance within the imperial household meant that she remained a figure of attention and suspicion during her brother's reign. Commodus came to power in 180 CE, and at first, his rule seemed promising. He made peace with northern tribes and returned to Rome in triumph. But quickly he revealed his taste for extravagance and neglect of traditional imperial duties. He left much of the empire's administration to corrupt favorites while immersing himself in games, chariot races, and gladiatorial contests. This behavior alienated the Senate and many within the aristocracy, who viewed him as unworthy of the throne. Lucilla, deeply conscious of her family's legacy, reportedly grew disillusioned with her brother's conduct. Sources suggest she may have been involved in a conspiracy against him in 182 CE, only 2 years into his reign. The details remain debated whether she was the mastermind or merely implicated, but the plotters intended to assassinate Commodus and place another member of the family on the throne. The conspiracy failed when one of the assassins revealed their intentions too soon. Commodus was alerted, and the conspirators were swiftly arrested. Lucilla's fate was sealed. Despite her status as his sister and her prior role as empress, Commodus ordered her execution. She was exiled to the island of Capri, and soon afterward, she was killed. Ancient historians such as Cassius Dio and Herodian emphasize the coldness of this act. Commodus did not spare even his closest kin when he felt his power threatened. To him, family ties mattered less than absolute control of the throne. This decision highlights a recurring pattern among monarchs who killed their wives or consorts. Suspicion of betrayal outweighed any bond of affection or loyalty. In Commodus's case, his paranoia grew from both personal insecurity and political necessity. He knew that many in Rome disapproved of him, and he feared that Lucilla, with her prestigious lineage and imperial experience, could become a rallying point for opposition. By eliminating her, he removed a rival but at a steep cost to his own reputation. For the Roman people, Lucilla's death was another sign of Commodus's descent into tyranny. His reign continued with increasing extravagance and violence. He renamed Rome after himself, styled himself as the reincarnation of Hercules, and fought in the arena as a gladiator. The Senate despised him, and conspiracies continued to brew. Ultimately, in 192 CE, Commodus was assassinated in a plot involving his mistress, Marcia, and members of his inner circle. Lucilla's story serves as a reminder of the fragile line between power and vulnerability in the Roman imperial household. Even a woman of her stature, daughter of a philosopher king, sister of an emperor, and former empress was not safe when the ruler viewed her as a threat. Commodus's decision to kill her revealed the dark reality of Roman monarchy. Survival depended on eliminating rivals, even within one's own family. Her execution also marks a link in the broader chain of imperial cruelty. From Claudius to Nero, from Caracalla to Commodus, the pattern remained consistent. Emperors turned against their wives, sisters, and consorts when power seemed threatened. In this way, the death of Lucilla fits squarely within the tragic theme of rulers whose paranoia destroyed their households. And just as Rome reeled from Commodus's tyranny, far to the east another dynasty faced its own palace tragedies. In Korea, King Xuanzong of Joseon would become infamous for killing royal concubines, including those of his own father, in acts of fury and paranoia that shocked his court and solidified his reputation as one of the most despised monarchs in Korean history. King Xuanzong of Joseon. Korea. Among Korea's long line of rulers, King Xuanzong of Joseon reigned 1494-1506, is remembered not for achievements, but for tyranny and cruelty. Historians often rank him as one of the worst monarchs in the dynasty's history. His reign marked by purges, censorship, and reckless violence. While many kings in our account condemned their own wives or consorts, Xuanzong's cruelty extended even further. He ordered the deaths of his father's concubines, women who had once belonged to the royal household but posed no real threat to his throne. This shocking act of violence underscores his paranoia and disregard for Confucian norms of filial piety, which prized respect for one's parents and their household. Xuanzong was the son of King Sukjong and his queen, Lady Yun. His mother's fate left a deep scar on his life and shaped his reign. Lady Yun, accused of misconduct and rivalry with other consorts, was deposed and executed in 1482 when Xuanzong was still a child. Growing up, he learned of his mother's disgrace and harbored bitterness toward the officials who had supported her downfall. When he became king in 1494, he sought to avenge her, setting the stage for one of the bloodiest periods of Joseon history. One of Xuanzong's most notorious acts was the so-called First Literati Purge of 1498, in which he targeted scholars and officials accused of criticizing his mother's execution. Many were executed or exiled, and the purge created a climate of fear within the court. His rule soon became synonymous with instability as he lashed out against both perceived enemies and established traditions. The execution of his father's concubines occurred within this broader context of vengeance and paranoia. After uncovering records that detailed his mother's deposition, Xuanzong grew enraged. Blaming his father's concubines for having contributed to her downfall or simply associating them with his mother's disgrace, he ordered them put to death. These women, who were not his own wives but members of the royal harem from the previous reign, became victims of his wrath. Their deaths shocked the court, for such actions violated Confucian principles that emphasized respect for one's father's household, even after his death. The killings revealed Xuanzong's inability to separate personal grievance from political rule. By punishing his father's concubines, he sought to symbolically erase the memory of his mother's humiliation, but in doing so, he destabilized the palace and alarmed his officials. His disregard for norms of filial piety damaged his legitimacy, for in Confucian society, a king was expected to model virtue and respect for family. Instead, Yen Sangun embodied the opposite, allowing his anger to override tradition and morality. Beyond the palace, his tyranny extended to society at large. He suppressed freedom of expression, banning criticism of the monarchy, and imposed heavy taxes to fund his extravagant pleasures. He converted the royal palace into a place of indulgence, ignoring the needs of his people. His violence against his father's concubines was thus not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of cruelty and excess that defined his rule. Ultimately, Yon Sangun's reign ended in disaster. In 1506, a coup led by officials and supported by the military forced him to abdicate. He was replaced by his half-brother, King Xuanzong, and died in exile shortly afterward. His legacy is one of shame, remembered as a ruler whose paranoia and vengeance destroyed lives and weakened the stability of the Joseon dynasty. The execution of the concubines illustrates once more the vulnerability of women in royal households. Even those no longer at the center of power could become victims when kings turned violent. For Yon Sangun, the act may have felt like retribution for his mother's humiliation, but for history, it stands as evidence of his tyranny and disregard for moral order. And as Korea reeled under Yon Sangun's cruelty, another empire, the Ottoman court, would soon provide its own infamous example. Sultan Ibrahim, remembered for instability and extravagance, would be accused of killing his favored concubine and drowning members of his harem, a tale that, though debated, reveals how suspicion and power made the lives of royal women perilous across cultures. Nero and Poppaea Sabina. Alleged. The name of Nero, Rome's fifth emperor, looms large in the history of tyranny and cruelty. We have already examined his execution of Claudia Octavia, his first wife, whose innocence and popularity did not spare her from imperial suspicion. Yet Nero's second wife, Poppaea Sabina, is also tied to one of the most infamous allegations in Roman history. According to ancient historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, Poppaea died in 65 CE after Nero, in a fit of anger, struck her while she was pregnant. Modern historians, however, debate whether this account is fact or rumor, leaving her death as an alleged case of imperial uxoricide rather than one firmly attested. Poppaea Sabina was a remarkable figure. Born into a wealthy family, she was renowned in Rome for her beauty, elegance, and ambition. Before marrying Nero, she had already been married twice, including to Otho, who would later briefly become emperor himself during the Year of the Four Emperors. Her union with Nero was politically and personally significant. Poppaea was said to have encouraged Nero to divorce Octavia and consolidate his rule, aligning herself as both partner and strategist. Once Octavia was eliminated in 62 CE, Poppaea assumed the role of empress. She became influential in court, shaping Nero's decisions and enjoying a degree of visibility unusual for Roman women of the time. Ancient writers portray her as ambitious and calculating, though such depictions may reflect biases of their male authors, who often criticized powerful women as manipulative. Regardless of whether she was a schemer or simply a woman navigating the perils of imperial politics, Poppaea stood at the very heart of Nero's court. The story of her death, however, casts a grim shadow. According to Tacitus, during an argument with Poppaea, Nero kicked her in the abdomen while she was pregnant, causing her to die soon after. Suetonius and Cassius Dio repeat similar versions of this account, embedding it into the historical memory of Nero's cruelty. Yet scholars have long debated the reliability of these reports. Roman historians often vilified emperors they disliked, embellishing stories to highlight their supposed depravity. Poppaia's sudden death could just as easily have been due to natural causes, such as complications from pregnancy, which were tragically common in antiquity. Despite these doubts, the story of Nero's violence against Poppaea gained traction because it fit neatly into his broader reputation. He was already remembered for extravagance, persecution of Christians, and his indifference during the Great Fire of Rome. Adding the death of his pregnant wife to this litany reinforced his image as a ruler devoid of restraint or compassion. For centuries, the tale became one of the defining anecdotes of Nero's reign, retold in literature, theatre, and moral histories as an example of tyranny's extremes. Whether fact or fiction, the story reflects the precariousness of life as an empress in Rome. Poppaea, like Octavia before her, illustrates how imperial women could become victims of political calculations, personal insecurities, or rumors designed to tarnish an emperor's legacy. Her death, real or alleged, became part of the moral lesson historians sought to teach. That absolute power corrupts not only governance, but also the most intimate bonds of family and marriage. For Nero himself, Poppaia's loss, whatever the cause, was significant. He later married Statilia Messalina, but Poppaea remained one of the most notable women of his life. Interestingly, Nero honored her with a lavish state funeral, unusual even for an empress, suggesting that her death may not have been the result of deliberate violence, but rather a tragedy he wished to memorialize. Yet the rumors persisted, cementing her place among history's tragic royal figures. Thus, the story of Poppaea Sabina sits uneasily between history and legend. It may never be known whether she died at her husband's hands or from natural causes, but the mere fact that ancient writers believed it plausible reveals how deeply Nero's reputation for cruelty had taken root. Her tale continues the theme of queens whose lives ended under the shadow of suspicion, reminding us that in imperial Rome, even love could not protect against the destructive power of rumor and authority. And as Rome grappled with the legacy of Nero's cruelty, another story from the same dynasty would emerge. Commodus, the notorious gladiator emperor, was also accused of turning against his own wife, Brutia Crispina. Her fate, though less certain than that of Octavia or Poppaea, adds another chapter to the tragic pattern of imperial consorts meeting their ends under suspicion. Commodus and Brutia Crispina, alleged. The reign of Commodus, from 180 to 192 CE, is one of the most notorious in Roman history. Known for his extravagance, obsession with gladiatorial combat, and neglect of statecraft, Commodus is often cited as a ruler whose failures accelerated the decline of the Roman Empire. Alongside his infamous acts of cruelty and his execution of his sister Lucilla, historians have long debated the fate of his wife, Brutia Crispina. Ancient sources are ambiguous, but many suggest that she, too, fell victim to her husband's suspicions, executed after being accused of adultery. Brutia Crispina came from a prominent senatorial family in Italy. She married Commodus around 178 CE before he officially became emperor, making her empress when he succeeded Marcus Aurelius in 180. At first glance, their marriage appeared to strengthen ties between the imperial household and the senatorial aristocracy, a class increasingly alienated by the emperor's autocratic tendencies. Brutia's youth, beauty, and noble background made her a fitting match for a prince who was expected to carry forward the legacy of the philosopher King Marcus Aurelius. Yet the union quickly soured. Commodus was not like his father. He lacked discipline, preferred the excitement of the arena to the responsibilities of the Senate, and allowed corrupt favorites to dominate politics. His erratic behavior destabilized the empire, and his paranoia grew with each passing year. In such an environment, even the empress was not safe from suspicion. Sources suggest that by the mid-180 Commodus accused Brutia Crispina of adultery. Whether this charge was true or fabricated is impossible to determine. Adultery was a common accusation in Rome's political culture, often used as a weapon to discredit rivals or justify their elimination. For emperors, it was especially potent, since an unfaithful empress could cast doubt on dynastic legitimacy. In Crispina's case, the accusation may have stemmed from Commodus's growing distrust of the senatorial class, to which she was closely tied. After the accusation, Crispina was exiled to the island of Capri. Exile, however, was rarely a permanent solution in imperial Rome. Once banished, individuals remained at the mercy of the emperor's whims. Ancient accounts suggest that Commodus eventually ordered her execution, though the specifics are unclear. Some sources place her death around 191 CE, just a year before Commodus himself was assassinated. Others leave her fate ambiguous, but the prevailing tradition holds that she was indeed put to death, another victim of the emperor's paranoia. For Crispina, the tragedy lies not only in her possible execution, but also in the silence of the historical record. Unlike Octavia or Poppaea, whose deaths were recorded in vivid detail, Crispina is mentioned only briefly by later historians. This silence may reflect the deliberate erasure of her memory, as often happened with disgraced empresses. Yet, the very persistence of the allegation that Commodus killed her indicates how strongly his reputation for cruelty shaped interpretations of his reign. The story of Brutia Crispina also illustrates the broader theme of women's vulnerability in the Roman imperial household. Even as empress, her fate depended entirely on her husband's trust. Once that trust was lost, whether through real betrayal or imagined suspicion, her position became untenable. Her downfall reflects the dangers faced by imperial women who, despite their exalted status, were always at the mercy of the emperor's shifting moods. For Commodus, Crispina's alleged death added to the growing list of personal betrayals and murders that defined his reign. He had already executed his sister Lucilla, alienated the Senate, and indulged in behaviors that shocked Roman sensibilities. By turning against his wife, he demonstrated once more that no bond was sacred when imperial suspicion was aroused. Ultimately, Commodus himself met a violent end, strangled in 192 CE in a conspiracy that included his mistress Marcia. The fate of Brutia Crispina, though less well documented, remains part of this broader narrative of imperial paranoia, where even those closest to the throne were not safe. And while Rome struggled under the weight of Commodus's excesses, another kingdom in Europe was facing its own palace scandal. In Castile, King Peter I, known to history as Peter the Cruel, was accused of ordering the death of his queen, Blanche of Bourbon, in circumstances that remain murky, providing yet another example of how royal wives could become casualties of suspicion and ambition. Peter I, the Cruel of Castile. Alleged. In the long history of Castile, few monarchs are remembered as vividly or as controversially as Peter I, who reigned from 1350 to 1369. Known alternately as Peter the Cruel by his enemies and Peter the Just by his supporters, his reign was marked by factional conflict, wars with neighbouring kingdoms, and relentless disputes with the nobility. Among the many dark tales attached to his name is the fate of his wife, Blanche of Bourbon, whom he married in 1353. Within days of the wedding, Blanche was cast aside, imprisoned, and, according to some accounts, eventually murdered on Peter's orders. Whether her death was directly caused by him or simply the result of neglect remains a matter of debate, but the allegation has secured her place in the tragic roll call of royal consorts destroyed by suspicion and politics. Blanche of Bourbon was a French princess, the daughter of Peter I, Duke of Bourbon, and Isabella of Valois. Her marriage to Peter of Castile was arranged as part of a political alliance between Castile and France, designed to strengthen ties between the two powerful kingdoms. At the time of their wedding, Blanche was only 16 years old. The union was celebrated with pomp, but behind the pageantry lurked hidden tensions. Peter had already taken a mistress, Maria de Padilla, with whom he was deeply infatuated. According to chroniclers, Peter abandoned Blanche almost immediately after their marriage. Returning to Maria, the young queen was left isolated in a foreign court without the protection of her family and subject to the hostility of Castilian nobles who were divided in their loyalties. Over time, her situation deteriorated further. She was imprisoned, moved from one fortress to another, and denied the dignity of her position as queen. The ultimate fate of Blanche is contested. French chroniclers accuse Peter directly of ordering her death in 1361, describing it as a deliberate murder meant to remove an unwanted wife and secure his freedom with Maria de Padilla. Castilian sources, however, sometimes portray her as having died of illness while in captivity, suggesting that the charge of murder was a piece of propaganda spread by his enemies. Regardless of the precise cause, her death at the age of 24 was undeniably the result of her abandonment and imprisonment, which were themselves acts of cruelty orchestrated by Peter. The story of Blanche of Bourbon became a weapon in the political battles of the time. Peter's rivals, particularly Henry of Trastamara, his half-brother and eventual successor, used it to discredit him. By portraying him as a husband who murdered his queen, they painted a picture of tyranny and immorality that justified rebellion. Over the centuries, the tale has been repeated in chronicles, plays, and histories, often emphasizing the tragic contrast between Blanche's youth and innocence and Peter's alleged brutality. From a broader perspective, Blanche's story illustrates the vulnerability of queens in medieval Europe. Marriages were rarely about affection, they were tools of diplomacy. Yet if a marriage failed to serve the king's interests, the queen could quickly find herself discarded, or worse. Blanche's downfall was not caused by personal failings, but by Peter's obsession with Maria de Padilla and his willingness to disregard both diplomatic obligations and moral norms. For Peter, the treatment of Blanche added fuel to his already divisive reputation. Some contemporaries praised him for attempting to curb the excessive power of the nobility and for promoting justice in his courts, earning him the title the Just among supporters. Yet stories like Blanche's ensured that others remembered him as the Cruel, a king whose personal desires outweighed his duties to his queen, his allies, and his people. The tale of Peter and Blanche, whether viewed as murder or neglect, underscores a recurring pattern in royal history: the expendability of queens when they no longer fit into a king's plans. Blanche's fate, preserved in both history and legend, remains one of the starkest reminders of how fragile a queen's position could be, even in the most glittering courts of medieval Europe. And while Blanche's story belongs to 14th century Castile, similar tales emerged in the Ottoman Empire centuries later. Sultan Ibrahim I, infamous for his erratic behavior, was accused of drowning concubines and killing his favorite, a scandal that remains one of the most shocking alleged episodes in Ottoman history. Ottoman Sultan Ibrahim I alleged. The Ottoman Empire, which spanned 3 continents and lasted over 6 centuries, was one of the most powerful empires in world history. Yet its sultans were not immune to the dangers of paranoia and cruelty within the palace. Among the most infamous was Ibrahim I, who ruled from 1640 to 1648. Nicknamed Ibrahim the Mad by later chroniclers, his reign was characterized by extravagance, instability, and scandals that shocked contemporaries. One of the most enduring allegations is that he ordered the execution of a favored concubine and, in a particularly lurid version, commanded the mass drowning of hundreds of women from his harem. While modern historians debate the accuracy of these stories, they reflect the enduring image of Ibrahim as a ruler whose instability placed even his closest companions in mortal danger. Ibrahim came to the throne under unusual circumstances. He had spent much of his life in confinement, as was customary for Ottoman princes not in line for immediate succession. When his brother, Sultan Murad IV, died in 1640, Ibrahim was released from the palace cage and declared sultan. Years of isolation, however, had taken their toll. Many accounts describe him as unstable, prone to erratic behavior, and excessively indulgent. The Ottoman harem, one of the most powerful institutions in the empire, became the stage for Ibrahim's most infamous acts. Concubines in the harem were not merely companions, but often wielded considerable political influence, particularly through the production of heirs. A favored concubine could rise to extraordinary heights, shaping court politics and enjoying immense wealth. Yet this influence also made them targets of jealousy and suspicion. The story most often told about Ibrahim is that he became enamored with a concubine named Shivakar Sultan, described as voluptuous and captivating. For a time, she held great sway over him. However, at some point, Ibrahim reportedly turned against her. Later chroniclers claim he had her executed, though the details are murky. Even more sensational is the allegation that Ibrahim, upon hearing rumors of infidelity within the harem, ordered the drowning of hundreds of concubines in the Bosporus. This story, repeated in European accounts of the 17th century, cemented his reputation as a tyrant consumed by paranoia. Modern historians, however, question its plausibility. It may have been exaggerated by foreign observers eager to depict the Ottoman court as decadent and barbaric. Still, even if the numbers are inflated, it is possible that Ibrahim did order the deaths of some women, reflecting the very real dangers faced by those in the harem. What is undeniable is that Ibrahim's behavior alarmed both his court and his subjects. His extravagance drained the treasury, his reliance on favorites alienated the political elite, and his erratic decisions weakened the empire's stability. By 1648, his excesses had become intolerable. The Janissaries, supported by religious leaders and court officials, revolted. Ibrahim was deposed and later executed, bringing his troubled reign to an abrupt end. The allegations about Ibrahim's violence toward his concubines reveal more than just personal instability. They highlight the precarious position of women in the Ottoman harem. While some rose to extraordinary influence, such as Kazım Sultan and Hürrem Sultan in earlier generations, others lived under constant threat of suspicion and sudden death. Their lives were tied entirely to the Sultan's favor, which could vanish overnight. For historians, the stories about Ibrahim must be read critically. They may have been exaggerated by later writers, yet their persistence reflects how contemporaries understood the dangers of unchecked power. Ibrahim became a symbol of royal excess, his alleged acts serving as cautionary tales about the consequences of madness in high office. Whether or not hundreds of women truly perished under his orders, Ibrahim's reign remains a stark reminder of how queens and consorts could be imperiled by a ruler's whims. His story echoes those of other monarchs across cultures, where suspicion and instability turned love into lethal danger. And while the Ottoman Empire grappled with Ibrahim's scandals, in North Africa, another ruler, Moulay Ismail of Morocco, would earn a reputation for severity, with European accounts claiming he executed concubines suspected of infidelity. His reign demonstrates yet again how royal power, when coupled with suspicion, often turned deadly for the women of the court. Moulay Ismail of Morocco, alleged. In the history of Morocco, few rulers stand out as dramatically as Moulay Ismail ibn Sharif, who reigned from 1672 to 1727. Founder of the Alawite dynasty's long-lasting authority, he is remembered as both a nation builder and one of the most feared monarchs of his time. Western travelers often compared him to Louis XIV of France, not because of refinement or grandeur, but because of his absolute authority, military power, and relentless control over his subjects. Yet, along with his achievements, a darker side of Moulay Ismail's legacy endures. Accounts mostly from European observers claim that he executed wives and concubines when they were suspected of infidelity. While many details are anecdotal and possibly exaggerated, these stories have become part of his enduring reputation. Moulay Ismail ruled during a turbulent era when Morocco was consolidating its independence against both internal rivals and external pressures. He created a powerful standing army known as the Black Guard, composed largely of enslaved soldiers, and used it to enforce his authority across the kingdom. His reign was marked by extensive construction projects, including the building of palaces and fortresses, and by a diplomatic balancing act between European powers eager to influence North Africa. But while his political and military achievements were impressive, the stories that emerged from within his palace paint a picture of a ruler both feared and admired. One of the most remarkable aspects of Moulay Ismail's life was the sheer size of his harem. Estimates vary, but contemporary accounts suggest that he fathered hundreds of children, some sources claim over 800, a figure that would make him one of the most prolific fathers in history. Maintaining such a vast harem required strict discipline and control. According to European envoys and chroniclers, Moulay Ismail enforced harsh rules on his wives and concubines, punishing any suspected breach of fidelity with execution. Travelers' tales describe women being put to death for rumored disloyalty, sometimes publicly, as warnings to others. While it is difficult to verify the accuracy of these reports since European visitors often exaggerated exotic stories for their audiences, there is little doubt that the women of his household lived under constant surveillance. The emphasis on fidelity was not only personal but also political. Moulay Ismail sought to ensure that no child in his court could be suspected of illegitimate birth, which might threaten dynastic stability. Modern historians debate how much of this reputation is fact and how much is legend. Some argue that European accounts of Moulay Ismail's cruelty reflect Orientalist stereotypes, exaggerating the severity of his punishments to portray Muslim rulers as barbaric. Others point out that his obsession with loyalty and control is consistent with his overall governing style, which was uncompromising and often brutal. Even if the details were embellished, the existence of such stories indicates how contemporaries perceived him, as a ruler for whom even the most intimate relationships were subject to suspicion and deadly consequences. For the women of his court, the reality was clear. Their lives were entirely dependent on the favor of the Sultan. While some may have enjoyed luxury and influence, others faced the constant risk of falling into disfavor. The alleged executions of wives and concubines reflect the broader vulnerability of women in royal households, where affection and loyalty were often overshadowed by the political necessity of control. Moulay Ismail's reign lasted more than half a century, making him one of Morocco's longest-ruling monarchs. By the time of his death in 1727, he had secured his dynasty's place in Moroccan history, but he also left behind a legacy of fear. His name became synonymous with both strength and cruelty, a duality that continues to shape his memory today. His story fits into the broader theme of monarchs whose paranoia and suspicion destroyed their consorts. Whether every detail about his treatment of wives is true or embellished, the persistence of these accounts highlights a universal truth. In courts where kings ruled with absolute authority, queens and concubines were always at risk. And while Morocco was ruled by Moulay Ismail, further east another empire was producing its own legends of cruelty. In the Ottoman world, tales emerged of Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, ordering the execution of a beloved concubine known as Irene. Though modern scholars often treat this as a legend rather than fact, the story endures as one of the most sensational alleged episodes in Ottoman royal history. Mehmed II. Alleged. Mehmed II, also known as Mehmed the Conqueror, is one of the most celebrated figures in Ottoman history. He reigned from 1444 to 1446, and again from 1451 to 1481, most famously capturing Constantinople in 1453 and transforming the Ottoman state into a true empire. His military genius and administrative reforms earned him a place among the great rulers of world history. Yet alongside his achievements, a dramatic tale has circulated for centuries. The supposed execution of a concubine named Irene, whom he allegedly killed in front of his court to demonstrate his resolve. According to this story, which appears in European sources from the Renaissance period, Mehmed fell deeply in love with Irene, a Greek concubine of extraordinary beauty. His devotion to her was said to have alarmed his generals and advisors, who feared that his infatuation might distract him from his duties as sultan. To prove that he placed the needs of the empire above personal desire, Mehmed allegedly summoned his court, embraced Irene, and then killed her with his own hand. The act, so the story goes, shocked his audience, but also reassured them that their ruler would not allow passion to undermine his responsibilities. This tale became especially popular in European literature and art, where it was retold as a symbol of stern discipline and the dangers of love. Playwrights and poets seized on the story of Mehmed and Irene, often dramatizing it for audiences fascinated by the perceived exoticism of the Ottoman court. In these retellings, Irene became the tragic heroine whose beauty could sway an emperor, but whose life was sacrificed to the demands of power. Modern historians, however, approach the story with skepticism. There is little contemporary Ottoman evidence to support the claim, and many scholars believe it was invented or heavily embellished by European writers eager to portray the Ottoman court as both alluring and barbaric. The story reflects more about Renaissance views of the East than it does about Mehmed himself. Still, the persistence of the Irene legend tells us something important about the perception of power in early modern Europe. To Europeans, Mehmed II was not only the conqueror of Constantinople, but also a symbol of the tension between passion and authority. The tale of Irene served as a moral lesson. Even great rulers could be undone by love, unless they demonstrated absolute control. By killing her, Mehmed supposedly affirmed his identity as a sovereign whose duty to empire outweighed personal attachments. Whether true or not, the story illustrates how easily royal women became symbols rather than individuals. Irene, if she existed, is remembered not for her life, but for her death in service of a narrative about empire and discipline. Her alleged execution reflects the precariousness of women's positions in royal households, where their fates could be determined less by who they were than by the political messages their lives and deaths conveyed. For Mehmed himself, the Irene legend adds a darker note to an otherwise celebrated legacy. As conqueror of Constantinople, he is remembered for transforming world history. Yet the story of Irene reminds us that even the most revered rulers could be portrayed as cruel in the most intimate settings, sacrificing love to power. Thus, Mehmed II joins the long list of monarchs remembered fairly or not for turning against the women closest to them. And, while his alleged execution of Irene may be more myth than fact, the very endurance of the tale demonstrates how strongly audiences across time have associated kingship with the power to destroy as well as to create. As this story echoed across Europe and the Middle East, Persia would produce its own legend of royal cruelty. Khosrow II of the Sasanian dynasty was later accused of turning against a Byzantine princess, Mariam, often called Maria, in tales that blended history with rumor, once again showing how queens became casualties of political ambition and suspicion. Khosrow II of Sasanian Persia, alleged. Khosrow II, also known as Khosrow Parviz, reigned over the Sasanian Empire from 590 to 628 CE. His reign marked both the zenith of Sasanian power and the beginning of its decline. Khosrow was celebrated for his grandeur, his ambitious campaigns against the Byzantine Empire, and his patronage of the arts, but he was also remembered for personal excesses and a dramatic fall from power. Among the tales tied to his name is the alleged execution of a Byzantine princess named Maria or Mariam, who was said to be his wife or consort. Though the historicity of this episode is debated, the story reflects both the fragility of royal marriages and the use of rumor to tarnish rulers. Khosrow's relationship with Byzantium was complex. Early in his reign, after a period of internal conflict, he received military assistance from Emperor Maurice of Byzantium to regain his throne. This alliance was sealed through marriage. Khosrow married Maurice's daughter, who in some traditions is called Maria or Mariam. The marriage, if it occurred, symbolized the strong ties between the two great empires, blending diplomacy with dynastic politics. For the Sasanians, it also emphasized Khosrow's legitimacy, connecting him to the Roman imperial line. Yet relations between Persia and Byzantium soured after Maurice's overthrow and execution in 602. Khosrow launched a massive war against the Byzantines, claiming to avenge his father-in-law. His armies swept through the Levant, Egypt, and Asia Minor, bringing the empire to the height of its territorial expansion. During this period, tales about his treatment of Maria began to circulate. Byzantine sources, often hostile to Persia, alleged that Khosrow grew suspicious of his wife or treated her cruelly, with some even claiming he ordered her death. The historical evidence is murky. Persian sources are largely silent on Maria, while Byzantine chroniclers may have invented or exaggerated her fate to vilify Khosrow. Nevertheless, the persistence of the story reveals how marital relationships at the top of empires could become tools of propaganda. The notion that Khosrow killed a Christian princess reinforced Byzantine portrayals of him as a barbaric tyrant, justifying the war against him. Whether or not Maria was truly executed, the tale fits into the broader narrative of Khosrow's decline. By the 622nd, after decades of war, Persia was exhausted. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launched a brilliant counter-offensive, retaking lost territories and devastating Persian lands. Discontent spread within the Sasanian court, and Khosrow's own son, Kavad II, eventually deposed and executed him. Against this backdrop, stories of his cruelty toward Maria or other consorts resonated as symbols of a ruler who allowed paranoia and excess to corrode his household as well as his empire. The alleged execution of Maria highlights once again the vulnerability of queens caught in the cross-currents of imperial politics. Whether or not Khosrow truly condemned her, The fact that the rumor was widely believed shows how easily royal women became scapegoats in the narratives of power. To Byzantine audiences, Maria represented both innocence and the empire's honor, making her supposed death a powerful story of victimhood at the hands of a rival monarch. For Khosrow II, the allegation underscores the paradox of his reign. He presided over extraordinary military successes and immense wealth, yet his legacy is overshadowed by stories of cruelty and betrayal. His reputation in history is that of a ruler who reached too far, alienated too many, and ultimately fell victim to both his enemies and his own family. The story of Maria, like that of many royal consorts, blends fact and legend. It may never be known whether she truly perished by her husband's command, but the tale endures as part of the long history of queens whose lives were cut short by suspicion, ambition, or rumor. And as Persia struggled with the decline of Khosrow's rule, in neighboring Armenia another story emerged. Tigranes II, the great king of Armenia, would later be associated with the tragic fate of his wife, Cleopatra of Pontus. Though her death is shrouded in uncertainty, her story echoes the same theme. Queens entangled in politics could easily become casualties of power. Tigranes II of Armenia. Alleged. Tigranes II, often called Tigranes the Great, reigned from around 95 to 55 BCE and presided over Armenia's transformation into a formidable regional power. At its height, his empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean, making him one of the most powerful monarchs of his age. Tigranes' reign was marked by military expansion, alliances with formidable rulers, and ultimately, conflict with the rising power of Rome. Yet, like many kings in this account, his personal life became entangled with politics, and later traditions suggest that his wife, Cleopatra of Pontus, may have met a tragic end because of him. Cleopatra of Pontus was the daughter of Mithridates VI of Pontus, one of Rome's most dangerous enemies. Her marriage to Tigranes sealed a powerful alliance between the two kings, binding Armenia and Pontus together against Roman encroachment. For many years, this alliance was effective. The combined strength of Armenia and Pontus posed a serious challenge to Roman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra, as Queen of Armenia, embodied this partnership, serving both as a symbol of unity and as a potential conduit of influence between her father and her husband. However, the tides of power began to turn. Rome, under generals such as Lucullus and Pompey, launched successful campaigns against Mithridates and eventually against Tigranes himself. Armenia's fortunes declined, and the once proud king was forced to submit to Roman authority. In this context of defeat and shifting loyalties, Cleopatra's position became precarious. Later sources, blending history with rumor, suggest that Cleopatra urged her husband to resist Rome more fiercely, aligning with her father's defiance. Tigranes, weary of war and seeking to preserve what remained of his kingdom, opted for submission. This difference in outlook may have created tension between the royal couple. Some accounts imply that Cleopatra's opposition or her continued loyalty to Mithridates caused Tigranes to view her as a threat. According to these traditions, she was put to death, either directly by Tigranes' command or as a result of palace intrigue during the turbulent years of Armenia's decline. As with many stories from antiquity, the historical record is far from clear. Some historians argue that the tale of Cleopatra's death was a later invention, shaped by the dramatic fall of both her father and her husband. Others note that it fits into a broader pattern. Powerful queens, especially those connected to rival dynasties, were often accused of treachery and eliminated when political circumstances shifted. Whether factual or not, The alleged death of Cleopatra of Pontus at the hands of Tigranes II highlights the fragility of queenship in an era of empire building and imperial rivalry. Her life was shaped by the ambitions of two powerful men, her father and her husband, and her fate was tied to their successes and failures. When Mithridates fell and Tigranes submitted, she became a reminder of alliances that had turned into liabilities. For Tigranes, this story reflects the tragedy of his later years. From the height of power, he fell to humiliation before Rome, his empire dismantled, and his authority reduced. If he truly ordered Cleopatra's death, it may have been an act of desperation, an attempt to sever ties with a dynasty that had become toxic in the eyes of Rome. If not, the rumor itself reflects how contemporaries understood the cost of failure. In times of defeat, even queens could be sacrificed. Thus, Cleopatra of Pontus joins the long list of consorts remembered less for their lives than for their tragic ends. Her story demonstrates once again how royal women, despite their symbolic importance, were often the first casualties when empires crumbled. And while Armenia mourned the decline of its great king, China would produce its own tales of imperial cruelty. The Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty, was accused of executing or forcing the suicides of palace women, including concubines, in sweeping purges that reveal the dangers of living within the walls of absolute monarchy. Hongwu, Emperor of Ming China, alleged. The Ming dynasty was established in 1368 by Xuanzong, better known as the Hongwu Emperor. Rising from humble beginnings as a peasant and former Buddhist novice, he overthrew the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty and founded a new era of native Chinese rule. His reign, which lasted until 1398, was both transformative and terrifying. He created institutions that would define Ming governance for centuries, but he also ruled with an iron fist, purging enemies real and imagined. Among the many dark traditions associated with him are claims that he executed or forced to death numerous concubines and palace women. While historians caution that some of these accounts may be exaggerated or later inventions, they still highlight the atmosphere of fear that defined his rule and the precarious lives of women in his court. Hongwu's rise to power left him deeply suspicious of elites, ministers, and even his own household. Having endured poverty and war, he never fully trusted the aristocracy or the scholar official class, and he instituted harsh laws to prevent corruption and rebellion. His paranoia extended into the palace. The imperial harem, filled with wives and concubines drawn from across the empire, was a symbol of prestige but also a potential source of intrigue. Empress Ma, his principal wife, was revered and respected, but other women in the harem lived in constant uncertainty. Later chronicles claim that Hongwu established strict codes of conduct for palace women and enforced them ruthlessly. If a consort was accused of misconduct, disobedience, or involvement in plots, punishment could be severe. Some reports allege that entire groups of women were executed or compelled to take their own lives as part of palace purges. The details vary, and it is difficult to separate fact from rumor, since Ming historians often wrote with moralistic agendas, portraying rulers in starkly positive or negative terms. Still, the persistence of these stories suggests that Hongwu's reign was remembered as a time when even the emperor's closest companions could not escape his suspicion. Why would Hongwu target concubines and palace women? One reason may have been his deep concern with dynastic purity. He had fought hard to establish his legitimacy, and he was determined to ensure that his sons would inherit without dispute. Any hint of impropriety within the harem threatened that goal. Another reason was his general tendency towards severe punishments. Hongwu believed that harshness was necessary to maintain order, and he often applied this principle indiscriminately, whether to ministers, generals, or members of his own household. For the women of the Ming palace, this meant living in a gilded cage. They enjoyed luxury and status, but their lives were subject to the emperor's moods and suspicions. Alleged incidents of mass executions, whether true or exaggerated, reflect the broader reality. These women lived under the shadow of absolute power. Their fates were not determined by their own actions alone, but by the political atmosphere of the court and the emperor's relentless need for control. The legacy of the Hongwu emperor is thus deeply ambivalent. On one hand, he created the Ming state's foundations, from its bureaucracy to its land policies, and secured its independence from Mongol domination. On the other, he is remembered as a ruler whose paranoia bred terror. The tales of executed concubines fit within this larger pattern, reminding us that the cost of dynastic security often fell heaviest on those with the least ability to resist. Whether or not every detail is true, the memory of Hongwu's cruelty toward palace women underscores a recurring theme. Queens and consorts were always vulnerable. No matter how powerful the dynasty or celebrated the ruler, their position was at once exalted and fragile, a paradox that recurs across cultures. And while China remembered the founder of the Ming dynasty as both a savior and a tyrant, in Islamic Spain another ruler, Abd al-Rahman III of Córdoba, would be accused of killing concubines in his own court. Though the sources are uneven and often anecdotal, his story further illustrates how suspicion and power could turn royal palaces into perilous places for women. Abd al-Rahman III of Córdoba, alleged. In the 10th century, the Umayyad dynasty of Al-Andalus reached its height under Abd al-Rahman III, who ruled from 912 to 961 CE. His reign transformed the Emirate of Córdoba into a caliphate, rivaling Baghdad and Cairo in splendor and influence. Abd al-Rahman is remembered as a brilliant statesman and military leader who brought stability to Iberia after decades of fragmentation. Yet alongside his achievements, later traditions accuse him of cruelty within his own harem, alleging that he executed concubines suspected of betrayal. While these accounts remain unconfirmed and likely embellished, they shed light on the precarious lives of women in the courts of Islamic Spain. Abd al-Rahman III's rise to power was extraordinary. When he became emir at just 21, Al-Andalus was divided and threatened by both internal revolts and external Christian kingdoms. Through a combination of military campaigns, diplomacy, and reforms, he reasserted control and proclaimed himself caliph in 929, establishing Córdoba as the capital of a powerful and independent state. Under his rule, the city blossomed into one of the greatest centers of culture in the medieval world, with libraries, mosques, and gardens admired across Europe and the Middle East. The grandeur of his court, however, did not insulate it from the dangers of suspicion. The harem of Córdoba, like those of other great Islamic courts, was both a private household and a political institution. Concubines were drawn from across the Mediterranean and beyond, and they could rise to positions of significant influence, especially if they bore the ruler's children. But their lives were precarious, dependent entirely on the caliph's favor, and vulnerable to the intrigues of rivals. Later reports, often from hostile or sensationalist sources, allege that Abd al-Rahman III ordered the deaths of concubines when he suspected them of infidelity. Details are scarce and inconsistent. Some stories describe individual women accused of betrayal. Others suggest more generalized purges of the harem. In each case, the theme is the same. Suspicion was enough to bring about fatal consequences. Modern historians approach these tales cautiously. Abd al-Rahman was generally admired, even by later writers, for his leadership and achievements. The stories of concubine executions may reflect later attempts to dramatize his reign or to highlight the dangers of absolute monarchy. They also echo broader stereotypes about Islamic rulers in medieval European imagination, where tales of cruelty and decadence in Muslim courts were common literary tropes. Even if exaggerated, the persistence of these stories speaks to the fragility of women's lives in royal households. For concubines in Córdoba, as in other courts, affection and influence could vanish in an instant if the ruler's trust was lost. Their fates were tied not only to their own actions but to the suspicions and whims of the caliph. For al-Rahman III himself, the accusations of cruelty contrast sharply with his broader legacy. He is celebrated as one of the greatest rulers of Al-Andalus, a man who brought unity, prosperity, and cultural brilliance. Yet, the memory of alleged executions in his harem reminds us that even the most admired monarchs could be shadowed by stories of domestic tyranny. The tale of al-Rahman III thus brings our long sequence to a close. From England's Henry VIII to Rome's Nero, from China's Xuanzong to Morocco's Moulay Ismail, the theme has been the same. Wives and consorts, despite their exalted status, live precariously under the shadow of kings. Their lives and deaths reveal the darker side of monarchy, where love and loyalty were often eclipsed by suspicion and ambition. And while al-Rahman's court glittered with learning and culture, the whispered tales of executed concubines show that even in golden ages, the human cost of power could be devastating. His story, like those of the rulers before him, stands as a reminder of how fragile life was for queens and consorts when bound to monarchs who placed authority above affection. Emperor Zhu Yugu of later Liang, in the swirl of civil wars that followed the fall of the Tang, the 5 dynasties period produced rulers whose courts were as perilous as their battlefields. The name you flagged, Emperor Xuanzong of later Liang, captures that chaos perfectly, because even the label is a tangle. Later Liang never had an emperor styled Xuanzong. What we're really looking at is the brief and bloody reign of Zhu Yugui, a later Liang emperor who seized the throne in 912 and within months ordered his own empress put to death as his regime collapsed. If our goal is to tell the story of a king who caused his wife's death, Zhu Yugui, rather than a non-existent Xuanzong of later Liang, is the historically grounded figure. Set the scene. Zhu Yugui was the son of Zhu Wen, posthumously Emperor Taizu, the warlord who ended the Tang and founded later Liang. Zhu Wen's late years were marked by predation and paranoia. Court etiquette dissolved into fear, senior officers were purged, the imperial family's private life became public scandal, and succession was a live fuse. Within that atmosphere, Lady Zhang, already married to Zhu Yugu, was drawn into the lethal question of who would inherit. Sources describe how she warned her husband that his father appeared ready to pass the throne to a favored adoptive son. Convinced that delay meant death, Zhu Yugu moved first. He rallied guards, invaded the inner palace, and took power. The coup made him emperor, but it also set every faction in motion against him. His reign lasted only months. Loyalists gathered around his brother Zhu Yuzhen. Commanders weighed which side would prevail, and in the capital, the air thickened with rumor. In the spring of 913, a palace assault led by powerful officers shattered what remained of Zhu Yugi's control. It is at this last panicked moment that the act at the heart of this segment occurs. Seeing no path to escape, Zhu Yugui ordered a trusted retainer to kill Empress Zhang and then bring the curtain down on the rest of his inner circle. It is stark, intimate, and chilling. An emperor, having climbed to the purple through family blood, ends by extinguishing his own household, beginning with his wife. Why does this story belong in a roster of monarchs who killed their wives? Because it shows the pattern at its rawest. Empress Zhang was not a distant political rival. She was the partner who had stood beside him through the dynastic crisis. Her death was not courtroom theatre, nor a formal execution after months of proceedings. It was a last decision made inside a besieged palace, revealing how absolute power and absolute fear can twist marriage into a final act of control. We don't need graphic details to understand the brutality. The act speaks for itself. It's also a window into the way this era devoured certainty. Even names fracture. Your working label, Emperor Xuanzong of later Liang, reflects how easily temple names and regnal styles can slip when we move fast through chaotic decades. Later Liang's emperors were Taizu, Wenzu Yugu, who reigned without a temple name before being condemned posthumously, and the last ruler, commonly called Emperor Mo, Zhu Zhen. No Xuanzong appears in that line, and recognizing this keeps our narrative honest while we keep its momentum. For an audience, the power of this segment isn't in a catalogue of titles, but in the human logic of crisis. A usurper whose throne rests on an act against his father. A capital that will not accept him. A brother rising against him. And at the end, a doomed command to erase the spouse who shared his ascent. It's a bleak symmetry that echoes across monarchies. When the walls close in, many rulers reach first for the people closest to them. And that symmetry takes us straight to the next stop in our list, another court where private grievance and public authority fused into lethal action. Joseon, Korea, under a monarch whose rage overturned Confucian norms and targeted the women of the previous king's household. When the storm gathered over Seoul, King Yinsangon did not spare his father's concubines, and the shockwaves of that decision still define his name.